Book 2, The Orchard Reborn. Chapter 1, Ducks in the Bonsai Garden. The mornings at the convent had grown oddly peaceful, the kind of peace that made people nervous. The air smelled of fertilizer, candle wax, and faint regret. Somewhere, a radio murmured a song that might have been by Mandy Moore, or maybe just someone trying to sound like her. It didn't matter, the tune hung like a ghost over the bonsai garden, where tiny trees grew in perfect rows, like obedient children. It had been almost a year since the fire, a year since the visions, the levitations, the miracles, the heartbreak, and the strange musical contests that had left everyone half enlightened, half traumatized. Sister Dorothea was married to Gumbo now, legally, spiritually, and questionably. Their toddler, Chaos, was talking more these days, though no one ever quite understood what he was saying. His mixed curls bounced as he ran around the garden, muttering strange prophecies that sounded like baby gibberish. Sister Clotilde had stayed on the convent grounds, overseeing both the bonsai garden and the call centre, which was now staffed by recovering cult members who needed something to believe in that paid minimum wage. Concepcion, ever enigmatic, was her unisex pseudo-lover, sometimes sleeping in Clotilde's room, sometimes disappearing for days. There was a quiet understanding between them. Love, maybe, but filtered through exhaustion and incense. Everyone was holding their breath, pretending this was normal, but normal had never lived here. A montage of memory. Every so often, Clotilde's mind would drift. To Scott, the floating man-child who had once been worshipped like a saint, to Brenda and Sadie, whose arrival from another world had shattered reason itself, to Sister Supreme, hovering like a drag prophet in a cloud of glitter and holy water, to the miracle of the tiny wings when people grew feathers from their backs after hearing hymns sung by someone who didn't know his own divinity. Those memories flickered behind her eyes like old film reels. The mirror world, the frosting dimension, the scent of wild onions, and the laughter of ghosts, the fire that had nearly consumed them all. The sound of Gumbo's voice, gruff and tender, calling her back to earth. And then, of course, there was the toddler, Chaos, the one everyone said was touched by God or the devil or both. Enter the niece and nephew. When the letter came, Clotilde wasn't ready for it. 2 names she hadn't spoken in years, Luna and Merrick, her sister's children. They arrived on a Thursday, the day the ducks got loose in the bonsai pond, and Dorothea slipped on a patch of wet moss while holding a basket of pink yarn. It all went sideways at once, yarn tumbling, ducks quacking madly, Chaos giggling like a tiny lunatic, and Clotilde standing there in her kimono. She'd taken to wearing one on humid days for spiritual airflow, she said. Luna and Merrick just stood there watching. Luna, pale and quiet, eyes like fogged glass. Merrick, all sharp grin and 2 long arms, wearing a t-shirt that said, "I break for ghosts." "You must be Sister Clotilde," Luna said softly. "Mom said you smell like frankincense and trouble." Clotilde smiled, weary but warm. "Your mother wasn't wrong." The first few weeks were tense. Gumbo didn't trust them, said their eyes were too knowing. Dorothea tried to play peacemaker, but Chaos would cry whenever Merrick got too close. Concepcion mostly observed, smoking what she called jazz cigarettes behind the compost heap and muttering about energy shifts. But the strangest thing was how the house itself reacted. Doors opened by themselves. The wind sang in minor keys, and once someone swore they saw Luna in the chapel, praying. Only her reflection in the stained glass was smiling back when she wasn't. The museum job. When the town's small museum reopened, the Greater Port Lucinda Museum of Natural Curiosities and Dubious Artifacts, it seemed like the perfect distraction. Luna and Merrick applied for part-time work, claiming they wanted to connect with history. The curator, a thin man with the emotional range of a napkin, hired them on the spot after Merrick fixed a broken animatronic duck by humming to it. And that's when things began to get peculiar, because the museum had a basement. And in that basement was an exhibit that had never been on the tour map, one the curator claimed wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But when Luna and Merrick found it, the dust-covered sign read, open quote, "The Golden Orchard, Sisters of Divine Unreason," close quote. It was an exhibit dedicated to them, to the convent, to the fire, to the miracles, photographs, newspaper clippings, a tarnished rosary, even a broken bonsai tree behind glass, and at the very centre, a baby's shoe. tagged simply Property of Chaos. The air in the museum went cold, the lights flickered, and somewhere from the upstairs radio, Mandy Moore's voice began to echo again, warped, slowed, ghostly. Open quote, "I want to be with you." Close quote. Luna turned to Merrick. Merrick looked at her and whispered, "Aunt Clotilde's going to lose her mind." And maybe he was right, because outside in the convent garden all the ducks had gone silent. Chapter 2. The Tangerine Omen. The museum smelled like wet plaster, lemon polish, and the distant memory of something long dead. Every time the automatic doors exhaled, a chill slithered through the lobby and made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The niece and nephew, Vera and Nolan, had only been there a week, but already they'd managed to change the atmosphere of the place. Visitors whispered that the air inside felt different now. The docent said the paintings seemed to look back when you stared too long. And in the taxidermy hall, the eyes of the stuffed antelope glimmered faintly under the fluorescence, as if some new electricity had awakened behind the glass. Sister Clotilde had called it from the start. "They've got something in them," she'd said to Dorothea over tea. "Something that makes candles flicker even when there's no draft." Dorothea tried to stay optimistic. "Maybe it's just nerves. They've been through a lot. Their mother was a medium for 2 cults, 3 churches, and a home shopping network," Clotilde finished dryly. "I think we can safely assume the weird runs deep." The uneasy peace. Back at the convent, Gumbo sat on the back steps with the toddler on his knee, whittling a wooden spoon that looked more like a pelican's beak than anything functional. He kept watching the museum from a distance. A squat limestone building down the hill, the kind of place that always seemed to hum at night. "Kids like that don't end up in museums by accident," he muttered. "They're magnets for something. Don't know what yet." Concepcion, nearby, was painting a rock she claimed had told her its name was Gary. Her brushstrokes were fast and manic. Orange, teal, future, no pattern at all. "Maybe they're prophets," she said, "or portals." Gumbo spat into the dirt. "Or trouble." He'd been uneasy ever since Vera had handed him that pink handkerchief during supper 2 nights ago. "For luck," she'd said. But when he'd gone to wipe his mouth, the thing had whispered something that sounded like "not yet." He'd thrown it in the compost heap and hadn't slept right since. The strange dynamic sister. Clotilda's relationship with her sister had always been tense, and that tension bled into how she handled Vera and Nolan. Where Clotilde was rigid, moral, and quietly furious with the world, her sister, the children's mother, had been wild, airy, almost luminous in her disregard for convention. She'd been the kind of woman who could walk into a cathedral and make the candles lean toward her voice, the kind of mother who taught her children how to read palms before they learned multiplication. So when Vera and Nolan arrived, they brought with them that same chaotic vibration, that eerie, magnetic hum. Dorothea tried to make peace. She cooked big suppers, told jokes, put flowers in the vases, but the house still felt off. The light switches clicked by themselves. The mirrors seemed to delay reflections by a heartbeat. And every night, somewhere around 3:17 a.m., Scott the parrot woke up and began whispering the Lord's Prayer backward in a slow, guttural voice that wasn't his own. The incident with the ducks. One sticky afternoon, the sisters decided to hold a picnic by the duck pond to break the strange tension that had settled over everyone. Gumbo grilled sausages. Concepcion brought a lemon gin punch that could have doubled as paint thinner. The ducks, bless them, quacked warily from the shallows. Vera and Nolan sat side by side on the blanket, watching the birds like they were studying ancient hieroglyphs. "Do they ever stop moving?" Nolan asked. "Not unless they're sleeping," Dorothea said kindly. "They don't sleep," Vera said flatly. "They just change worlds." A moment later, one of the ducks froze mid-step, still as marble, eyes glazed. Then it toppled over sideways into the water with a small plop. The pond rippled pink for a second before going still. Everyone gasped. "Well, that's new," said Concepcion, sipping her gin. "It's like the Rapture, but feathered." Gumbo muttered a prayer and tried to shake it off, but the toddler began to cry. Deep, shaking sobs that sounded like recognition, not fear. A basket of yarn, a burst of pink. That evening, Dorothea found a basket of yarn on the convent porch, the same one the kids had carried when they first arrived. Only now each ball of yarn was an impossible shade of pink. Not pastel, not neon, but glowing like the inside of a conch shell lit by sunrise. When she touched one, the air trembled. Inside, Vera sat humming in front of the window. "Don't pull at the pink ones," she said without turning. "They're holding something together." Dorothea froze. "Holding what together?" Vera smiled faintly. "You'll see." And for the first time since she joined the convent, Dorothea felt a chill that no prayer could shake. Concepcion's wild afternoon. Meanwhile, across town, Concepcion was on one of her infamous errands, the kind that started simple, buy groceries, and ended with an existential police report. She'd gone to the market for milk, but fate had other plans. A frozen turkey sale caught her eye. Then a shopping cart rolled by with no one pushing it. "A sign," she whispered. Before anyone could stop her, she'd loaded the turkey, a bottle of gin, and a pack of discount bath salts into the cart and was off, singing in Spanish and claiming she was raising money for spiritual hygiene outreach. Somewhere between aisle 9 and the parking lot, she slipped on a puddle of melted ice, crashed into a display of tangerines, and sent them rolling across the floor like tiny comets. A man shouted, a baby screamed, and Concepcion, dazed but unbroken, held up the turkey like a sacred relic. "Behold the frozen bird of Bethlehem!" By the time police escorted her out, she'd baptized the assistant manager in gin and tried to explain something about Foot Rub Japan, a supposed ministry involving reflexology, redemption, and poultry. When she got back to the convent, Gumbo just sighed. "Do I even want to know?" "No," she said brightly, setting the turkey in the freezer. "But the tangerines were an omen." The peanut shell and the parrot tongue. That night, as the convent settled into its strange pulsing quiet, Gumbo stepped outside for a smoke. He barely got 2 steps off the porch before his heel landed on something sharp. "Ow! Son of a—" He looked down. A single peanut shell sat on the path, cracked perfectly in half, as though it had been placed there. He picked it up, frowning. It smelled faintly of tangerine. Before he could toss it, Scott the parrot called from the kitchen window, voice hoarse and strange. "Not yet, Gumbo, not yet!" Gumbo froze. "Scott, what the hell?" The bird blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then it whispered in the voice of a small child, "Don't eat the fruit." The tangerine warning. Later that night, Vera and Nolan returned from the museum pale and quiet. They'd found something strange there, a painting in the basement that hadn't been on display before. It showed the convent, surrounded by a halo of light, and in the foreground a small basket of tangerines. Underneath it was a plaque that read, "The Feast of the Golden Orchard, date unknown." When they told Dorothea, she felt the world tilt slightly sideways. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That's our orchard. That's us." Before anyone could speak, a thud echoed from outside. They ran to the porch. The lawn was covered in tangerines, hundreds of them, shining faintly in the moonlight, rolling toward the house as though pushed by invisible hands. Vera looked up at the sky and said softly, "They've started to wake." And from somewhere deep in the orchard, a low humming began. Gentle at first, then swelling, electric, alive. The trees seemed to shiver, their leaves rustling in impossible rhythm. Scott began to scream. The toddler began to laugh, and a wind smelling of wild onions and rain tore through the garden, carrying with it the faintest echo of music, half hymn, half warning. The sisters and Gumbo stood frozen, the glowing fruit gathering at their feet. Then, one by one, the tangerines began to split open, and inside something started to move. End of chapter. 6-month sparks. The convent had settled into a rare quiet, a deceptive calm after the tangerine incident, but calm never lasted long around these people. Gumbo, hobbling slightly, leaned against the side of the bonsai garden, nursing a toe he'd fractured on the twisted roots of a dwarf maple. "Of course it's the left one," he grumbled, shaking his head. Always the left one. He had tripped over nothing but his own cursed coordination, cursing the universe under his breath. Concepcion, meanwhile, was embroiled in one of her legendary misadventures. She had discovered an ancient toaster oven at the convent thrift corner and insisted on demonstrating its full spiritual potential using a Simon Says game from the 1980s she found in the attic. Half the convent's appliances had been unplugged in fear, By the third round, she had managed to burn a single slice of bread into a shape vaguely resembling a cherub's hand, singe her sleeve, and somehow send the small electrical timer spinning across the room like a miniature UFO. "Concepcion! Stop!" Clotilde yelled, her habit flaring as she lunged to unplug the oven, stepping directly on a stray pair of Gumbo's socks, which sent her careening into a table of foot rub oils Dorothea had left out for her self-care routine, and she nearly knocked over a bottle labelled Scleroderma Relief Balm, which fizzed ominously when it hit the floor. Amid the chaos, Dorothea herself had taken the toddler into the kitchen and whispered softly about patience and small miracles. The child, now articulating simple words, pointed at the toaster oven with a knowing look. It was clear he already understood far more about this world than the adults did. The museum momentum. Meanwhile, Vera and Nolan had begun settling into their roles at the museum. The building, run by the towering, thin, retired Professor Ed Brigsby, had been a maze of dusty displays, taxidermy and forgotten art when they arrived. Brigsby, all tweed jackets and monocle-less glare, had been sceptical at first, but it became impossible to argue with the results. Vera discovered a hidden skill for cataloguing, her eyes capable of noticing the slightest discrepancy between paint hues or labelling errors. Nolan, by contrast, had an almost supernatural intuition for organising visitor flows and spotting where an exhibit would draw attention. Their successes began piling up, praise from Brigsby, visitors smiling, donations coming in. The museum's quiet chaos was now humming with structure and purpose, and the two were thriving, though each day felt surreal in the way nothing had felt normal since their arrival at the convent. That evening, Dorothea had taken Clotilde and Concepcion to a 6-month anniversary dinner at a small candlelit bistro in town. Clotilde arrived in full habit, Concepcion in something vibrantly orange and impossibly patterned, and Dorothea had reserved a corner booth under the warm glow of hanging lanterns. They laughed, reminisced, and for a moment the world felt safe again. The toddler was asleep at the convent, watched over by a sleepy Gumbo and Scott, who had been attempting angelic hymns in low, tremulous notes. Just as Dorothea raised her glass, her phone vibrated. She looked down, frowning. "It's the convent," she said, voice tight. "Something's wrong. Clotilde, Concepcion, we have to go back, now!" Clotilde's hand tightened over her fork. Concepcion dropped her napkin, her eyes widening. "Disconcerting news," Dorothea said, her tone grave. And I mean disconcerting. Before anyone could ask questions, she ended the call. The three women sat frozen. Outside, the evening air smelled faintly of tangerine blossoms, a subtle reminder that nothing at the convent ever stayed quiet for long. The toddler stirred in his crib, reaching for the nightlight as though sensing the unease. Gumbo muttered from the background, "I don't like the sound of this." And just like that, the calm shattered, leaving them all poised on the edge of something that would demand every ounce of their wit, courage, and sheer resilience. Chapter 4. Fires in Memory. The day began innocuously enough, with the convent bathed in golden morning light that sifted through the bonsai garden like honeyed threads. Dorothea and Clotilde sat on the back patio, sipping tea, the toddler at their feet, practicing hovering over a small stack of blocks. The sensation in their chests was unmistakable, that familiar fluttering, a strange and inexplicable energy that had been creeping up inside them for days. The butterfly-like ripples in their stomachs seemed to resonate with something they couldn't yet name, and yet both felt a sense of déjà vu, as if their bodies remembered something their minds had forgotten. I think I'm remembering," Clotilde whispered, her eyes unfocused, staring across the garden. Not just seeing, remembering. Dorothea leaned back, squinting as the wind brushed against her face. "What do you mean?" Clotilde's lips parted, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. "Do you remember the fire in the open field? The one back in that year?" It was a memory they hadn't spoken aloud in decades. The jungle, humid and alive with sounds of insects and distant, lowing animals. A massive blaze, roaring and devouring everything in sight. They had been much younger, naive in ways only youth allows, caught in a situation that had seemed both terrifying and transformative. "They were clearing brush," Dorothea murmured, "or trying to. We didn't understand what it meant, but the fire, it called to something inside us." And then, strangely, the memory threaded through another reality entirely. Gumbo, in Vietnam, in a timeline that should have been impossibly separate, appeared. He was lying on his stomach in a mud-filled hole, gun at the ready, eyes wide and tense, sweat running down the sides of his face. And yet, impossibly, he was there, at the fire's edge, just for a brief instant, as if the veil between realities had thinned enough for him to touch their world. The memory hit them like a physical punch, the remembered heat of the fire almost scorching their skin. They looked at each other, eyes wide, realizing how much they had forgotten, how much had been hidden in corners of their minds, hidden, yet never truly gone.
I'll return!
The garden gate clicked, and a familiar, confident voice called out, "Ladies, I hope I'm not interrupting the flames of the past." Cora had returned to town, radiant and larger than life, her new husband Sean trailing behind her, equally vibrant and impossibly patient. Cora's hiatus from her Christian contemporary music career had been brief, but in that time she had transformed, both in spirit and in the way she moved through the world. "I couldn't stay away," Cora said, embracing Dorothea first, then Clotilde. "I had to see you both, the garden, the toddler chaos," she added, gesturing to the levitating blocks. "And I wanted to talk about something important." Sean smiled at everyone politely, slightly awkward as he absorbed the strangeness of the convent world. "I hear you've been making objects float," he said, nodding to the toddler, "and there's something magical going on here." Cora chimed in. "Exactly, and the painting in the gallery with Loon and Merrick? It's responding to the kids. It's communicating with them, not words exactly, but feelings, instincts, guidance. I think we need to start listening to it, but safely, strategically, carefully. It might actually help with everything that's happening here." Butterflies and levitation. Dorothea and Clotilde exchanged glances, both feeling the same strange resonance in their chests and stomachs. The sensation intensified whenever the toddler gestured toward objects in the room. A small vase hovered, then a silver serving spoon, then the toddler's cup. Meanwhile, the parrot squawked, pacing back and forth. "I am not called Scott! Stop insulting me!" "His name is Scott," Dorothea whispered, bewildered. "Yes!" the parrot screeched, feathers fluffed in indignation. "I am not that parade blimp of a creature from the other reality. My name is Harold, and I demand it be respected." Concepcion, exhausted and snapping from the ongoing chaos, leaned back in a chair and muttered, "Fine. His name's Harold. Happy now?" She stormed out after an incident with the freezer. A frozen turkey and a stolen shopping cart had collided in a sequence of events she refused to recount, leaving a wake of broken kitchen tiles and gin bottles behind. Museum successes and toddler chaos. In the gallery across town, Loon and Merrick were adjusting to their roles as rising stars in the museum's art department. They had finally started to interpret the painting, discovering it responded not just to the children, but to the very energy of the convent itself. Tiny, subtle changes, a shift of colour here, a brushstroke there, guided the children to small insights about the world and themselves. Back at the convent, the toddler's ability to levitate objects grew more pronounced. A paperweight floated along the table like a mini-orbiting planet, and small crystal orbs hovered around the bonsai garden. Dorothea held her breath, Clotilde's eyes shone with awe, and Gumbo, hobbling on his still fractured toe, muttered, "We've officially lost reality, haven't we?" Climactic moment. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the bonsai garden in molten gold, the phone rang. Dorothea answered immediately, listening intently, her face growing pale. "It's serious," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Everyone, you need to come back to the convent immediately. Something disconcerting has appeared. I don't fully understand it yet, but it's not waiting for us to get our bearings." Scott's levitating objects paused mid-air. Chaos tilted his head at the sudden tension. Clotilde's chest butterflies fluttered wildly, sensing the impending confrontation. Concepcion's absence hung like a storm cloud over the garden. The toddler pointed at the horizon, one small hand floating upward. "There," he said, clearly indicating the source of the disruption, though none of the adults could yet see it. And as the last rays of sunlight vanished, the convent, once calm for a fleeting moment, braced itself for the next wave of impossibility. Chapter 5. The Secrets Buried in the Walls. The museum was quiet that night, eerily quiet, the polished floors reflecting the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. Loon and Merrick had stayed late, determined to examine the painting in isolation. Brigsby, ever the eccentric retired professor, had handed them the keys with a conspiratorial wink. "You're the only ones here," he said, voice creaking like old wood. "Don't let the painting think you're unworthy." The children nodded, their nerves thrumming with anticipation. As soon as Brigsby left, the air seemed to thicken, a subtle vibration passing through the room. The painting hung on the wall, its brushstrokes shifting almost imperceptibly like the waves of water disturbed by a stone. Loon approached first, small fingers trembling, and touched the frame. The painting pulsed with energy, and suddenly the figures within it shimmered and moved as though alive. The niece and nephew stumbled backward, heartbeats racing. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Merrick whispered, It's like it's aware of us." Before either child could react, the painting's colours swirled into a vortex of light and shadow, and for a split second, it felt as if the museum itself were collapsing around them. Cotton candy pink and soft lilac hues filled the air, giving the space a sickly sweet smell. Loon gagged, twisting to see the source. "What's happening?" Merrick cried. They had no control, and the energy seemed overwhelming, a chaotic force that threatened to push them off their feet. For a moment, confusion, fear, and betrayal surged through them. Why was the painting doing this?
Why now? Why them?
The ancient book and the bones. Meanwhile, back at the convent, Concepcion was attempting to help renovate the walls. Still jittery from last night's incident involving a frozen turkey and a half-empty bottle of gin. While scraping plaster away in the farthest corner of the bonsai garden wing, she discovered a cavity filled with hundreds of bones, thousands really. Buried among them, a leather-bound ancient book. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but some passages were still legible. One particularly clear section explained the painting's strange activity. Open quote, "Though the colours may swirl in confusion and the observer may feel disoriented, the hand that moves the brush serves the unseen good. What seems dangerous is a guide, a force of growth, and only those with courage may interpret its intentions." Close quote. Concepcion read the passage aloud, her voice trembling. Nearby, she paused to adjust her size double D bra straps, that a minor inconvenience in the midst of the eerie discovery. Her hands shook, and in a moment of alcohol-related weakness from lingering gin, she collapsed into a seizure. Clotilde arrived just in time to steady her and offer water and comfort. Confusion, tweezers, and meth mouth. At the museum, Loon and Merrick were panicking. The painting continued to swirl, and strange shadows seemed to slither along the walls. Loon tried to calm himself, but in the process bit down on his fingernails so hard that he nicked the skin. The taste of blood reminded him of a meth mouth he had seen in a documentary, sharp, metallic, and bitter. Merrick grabbed a pair of tweezers from the supply shelf, trying to steady his nerves by cleaning tiny specks of dust from the painting's frame. Their anxiety mounted, and yet, in that very chaos, the painting began to communicate. Subtle, gentle vibrations that felt like guidance rather than threat. Supernatural revelations. That night, while everyone's panic peaked, the niece and nephew realized something astounding. The painting's confusion, while initially terrifying, was a test, not of danger, but of perception. The shapes, shadows, and swirling colors were providing a pathway to understand its message. Each burst of chaos was a coded signal, a direction to follow, though the children could not articulate it yet. Back at the convent, Concepcion and Clotilde examined the ancient book further. The bones surrounding the cavity seemed to serve a ritualistic purpose, a marker of the energy that had been guiding the convent and the children's lives in subtle ways. Open quote, "The seemingly perilous is actually a conduit," Clotilde whispered, "a force that helps those who are brave enough to endure its chaos." Close quote. Concepcion shivered, thinking of the cotton candy haze that Loon and Merrick had described, and suddenly it all made sense. The chaos was guidance, the fear a lens through which the children would learn, grow, and eventually harness the painting's energy for good. A biblical passage for perspective. Clotilde, ever practical even in the midst of the extraordinary, pointed to a verse in the book of Proverbs that had been tucked into one of the book's margins. Open quote. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. Close quote. She read it aloud, feeling its resonance, the truth of it echoing in her chest, the same fluttering as the butterfly sensation she had felt for weeks. It reminded them that courage was necessary and that confusion often precedes understanding. Cliffhanger ending. Concepcion, still recovering from her incident, picked up the book and whispered, "We have to guide them. They're in danger, yes, but not the kind we first imagined." The camera-like gaze of the painting seemed to flicker in response to the words, almost approvingly. The niece and nephew, unaware of the book's existence, were still alone at the museum, hearts pounding, guided by a force they could not yet comprehend. The toddler back at the convent, hovering a tiny orb over a bonsai, seemed to sense the energy from the museum, his small voice whispering, "Help them." And in distance, the faint smell of cotton candy lingered, sweet, chaotic, and impossibly alive. 6. Bones, breaths, and the Judah waltz. By the time dawn split the cypress and magnolia trees, the convent grounds buzzed with tension. The discovery of the bones had turned the once tranquil bonsai garden into a carnival of disbelief and dust. Sister Dorothea stood frozen before the excavation pit, her habit streaked with clay and her breathing uneven. She couldn't take her eyes off it, the thousands of tiny bones glinting in the early light like ivory confetti. Femurs, ribs, finger bones, even what looked like the tip of a saint's jawbone, all tangled like roots of a forgotten orchard. The air was thick, electric, whispering. It was too much. "Why here? Why us?" she muttered, her voice trembling like wet parchment. Clotilde placed a hand on her shoulder, but Dorothea shrugged it away. She swayed, dizzy, her breath hitched. "It's all connected," she said. "The painting, the child, the bones. It's all been whispering, hasn't it? Watching, waiting." Her eyes went glassy, and before anyone could stop her, she dropped to her knees in the mud, sobbing into her palms. Cora rushed forward, her hair tied up in a red bandana, Sean close behind her in a sleeveless denim shirt, smelling faintly of motor oil and malt shop sugar. Together they lifted Dorothea, got her inside, and settled her in her narrow room with her CPAP humming beside the bed. "Rest," Cora said, her voice sweet as spun candy. "You've carried too many ghosts." Sean squeezed her hand and winked. "We'll take care of things out there." But that wasn't exactly what they did. The wild and the irresponsible. Instead of staying close, Cora and Sean took off in his 1982 Buick Riviera, its muffler growling like a beast halfway redeemed. They were headed for a sock hop revival down in the city, a neon-lit charity event with jukeboxes, root beer floats, and a live band that promised real drums, real rhythm, real spirit. "Yo-ho! Let's go," Sean said, sliding behind the wheel. Cora laughed. "We're terrible adults, you know that? That's why God invented repentance, babe." They left Dorothea sleeping, CPAP steady, the world supposedly under control. At the sock hop, they danced until their shoes squeaked and the floorboards trembled. The band played Judah Waltz, a song that was half gospel, half rockabilly fever dream. Cora spun and twirled until her skirt fanned like a halo. Sean banged his palms against a stray snare drum and shouted, "Wham bam, thank you, ma'am," to the rhythm of the beat. But back at the convent, something quiet and invisible slipped its fingers over Dorothea's bedside. The CPAP hose detached itself. No one could ever explain how. Maybe a tremor in the floorboards, maybe a restless wind, maybe something else. The machine hissed useless air into the sheets as Dorothea's chest rose, then fell, then stopped altogether. The toddler's toys began to levitate, one by one, as if they knew. The bone chimes of New Orleans. While all this chaos simmered unseen, Gumbo was already down in New Orleans. He drove an '89 Ford Tempo with a dented hood and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. The 1969 Chevy Impala sat rusting back at the convent, waiting for better days. He parked near Jackson Square, trunk full of wind chimes he'd made from the smaller convent bones. He called them echo spirits. Some folks bought them out of curiosity, others out of pity. A few swore they could hear faint hymns when the breeze hit them just right. "Wham! Bam! Thank you, ma'am," Gumbo muttered each time he made a sale, stuffing dollar bills into a coffee can. Miracles pay the rent. He played his hand drum between transactions, tapping rhythms that mixed old Creole beats with ghostly undertones. Tourists clapped. Street preachers scowled. Gumbo smiled and thought, if the dead can sing, let 'em. Back at the convent, Dorothea's breathing finally faltered to nothing. Clotilde and Concepcion ran in, found her pale and still, and screamed for help. The resurrection of Santa Claus. Sean and Cora were still in their Buick when they got the call. The song on the radio, something about Santa Claus riding a comet through Bethlehem, crackled with static. Cora froze. Sean's smile faded. He floored the gas pedal. They roared back toward the convent, hearts pounding in sync with the drums echoing from the sock hop that still played in the distance. When they arrived, paramedics were already working on Dorothea. Cora fell to her knees, praying, her lipstick smeared across her knuckles, and then, impossibly, Dorothea coughed. The CPAP sputtered back to life. Breath returned to her like a wave retreating from the shore, only to crash again. "She's breathing," someone said. "She's alive," Cora whispered. Sean just stared, trembling, whispering, "Yo-ho, that's a miracle! Oh, the dropped car!" The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the magnolia branches, Sean decided to clear his head by working on the 1969 Impala in the shed. He had plans for it, wanted to make it purr again, maybe even take Cora on a road trip once all this madness was behind them. He slid beneath the chassis, wrench in hand, humming an old Duda refrain. Gumbo's bone chimes swayed outside, singing their eerie tune. Cora stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him work. "Be careful," she said softly. He winked. "I always am." The jack creaked, metal groaned, and then a crack like thunder. The Impala shifted, then dropped. Cora screamed. The whole convent echoed with it. Dust filled the air. The chimes outside went wild, clattering and clinking, whispering something in their bone-born language. Sean was pinned, his breath shallow but steady, his eyes fluttered. He was alive, barely. As Cora shouted for help, a strange wind swept through the shed, carrying the faint sound of a voice none of them could place. It sounded like Dorothea's, but softer, otherworldly, half lullaby, half warning. Open quote, "The bones remember what we forget." Close quote. The chimes stilled. The world held its breath. End of chapter. Chapter 7. The Mirror Breathes. The convent had gone half silent since Sean's accent. Only the low whir of medical machines and the soft patter of rain filled the air. Sister Dorothea sat by his bedside in the infirmary, humming a hymn that didn't seem to exist anywhere but her own heart. The others kept vigil too, Concepcion pacing, Clotilde praying in circles, Gumbo outside under the dripping magnolias with his head bowed, muttering, "Hold on, boy, don't you go where the bones sing." Even the toddler seemed subdued, stacking blocks in solemn silence, his tiny brow furrowed as though he knew that something bigger than words hung over them all. The parrot's fury. Down the hallway, Mr. Hollis, a tall, weary man with kind eyes and slow knees, was sweeping the floor when Scott the parrot began his daily tirade. "I said my name is Ralph," the bird screeched, fluttering in angry circles. All right, Ralph, then," Hollis sighed, half amused. "You a whole preacher this morning, ain't ya?" Scott, or Ralph, flapped to the window ledge, puffed up like a sermon gone rogue. "Nobody listens. Nobody ever listens." The janitor laughed softly. "You and me both, buddy." But then something shifted. The air around the parrot trembled. His feathers shimmered like oil on water, and a faint electric hum spread through the hallway. Clotilde entered just in time to see the light flicker overhead. "Scott, calm yourself," she warned, but instead his eyes blazed with uncanny brightness. He beat his wings so furiously that a gust of wind blew through the corridor, scattering prayer sheets like a snowstorm. Then came the sound, low, resonant, like glass sighing. The mirror in the convent chapel, the special mirror, began to glow. The mirror's awakening. Clotilde froze. Concepcion stumbled in, dizzy from another of her unpredictable spells, eyes wide, hands trembling. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered. The mirror pulsed once, twice, and the surface rippled as though made of living water. Clotilde approached it slowly. "We didn't summon him. We didn't even ask," she said. The parrot squawked. "He comes when he wants. He comes when he needs." The janitor backed away, crossing himself. "Lord, what kind of work you got me mopping in here?" The glow deepened to an otherworldly silver. Figures began to form. First shadows, then colours, then that familiar, clumsy outline. The spirit of Scott, the headless and armless presence from the other world. The dumb, gentle, holy fool. His form shimmered like candlelight, wavering in the frame, eyes soft, mouth open in wordless wonder. A warm rush of wind filled the room, and for a moment everyone forgot to breathe. Then he smiled, and just as quickly the mirror dimmed. Concepcion gasped and clutched her head. The energy had knocked something loose inside her. Her body jerked, muscles seizing with the old familiar violence of her condition. "He's still here," she hissed. "He's here, but not here." The mirror pulsed again, faintly this time, like a heartbeat fading into distance. At the museum. That same night, far across town, Loon and Merrick were alone in the museum. They'd stayed after hours with permission. Professor Brigsby had left them the brass keys and a single lamp to light the marble corridors. The place smelled of dust, old paint and secrets. The painting, the one that had whispered to them before, was waiting in Gallery 4, surrounded by silent taxidermy and glass cases that held ancient artifacts of uncertain origin. "It's glowing again," Loon said quietly, stepping closer. "Same as before, just faint, like it's breathing." Merrick lifted the lantern. The image in the frame seemed to move, the brush strokes shifting subtly, like the face of the world changing expression. Then beneath the frame, Merrick noticed something new, a hairline crack in the wall. He touched it, and a small piece of plaster flaked away, revealing letters carved into the stone beneath. "Look," he said, brushing away dust. "Latin." Loon leaned closer and whispered, "Speculum lumen, porta viva, the mirror of light is the living door." They both turned pale. "The mirror," she said, "it's not just decoration, it's connected." Merrick took a shaky breath. "To them, to the convent." Before they could say more, footsteps echoed through the gallery. Brigsby's tall, wiry shape appeared in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his hands tucked behind his back. "Working late, are we?" he said, voice too calm. "Curiosity can be enlightening or dangerous." His smile never reached his eyes. Loon swallowed hard. "We found something behind the wall," she said quickly. "It looks important." "Oh, everything here is important," he said, turning toward the main doors. He closed them slowly. The metallic click of the lock echoed through the museum halls like a gunshot. Merrick's pulse quickened. "Professor, why are you locking us in?" Brigsby didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the painting and laid a single palm against it. The colours shimmered the same way the mirror had. "I've been waiting for this," he whispered. "It's beginning again." The lights flickered once, twice. The painting's eyes seemed to open. Loon grabbed Merrick's arm. "We have to go." Brigsby turned toward them, smiling faintly, the light of the painting washing over his face in ghostly gold. "Go," he said softly. "My dear children were already inside." The glow engulfed them all. The night split itself in two. Half of it was silent, the other half humming like a bad radio between stations. It was the hour when dreams and memory overlap, the exact kind of hour when Scott appears. Only this time he didn't just appear. The mirror began to hum first, a faint low vibration, like 1,000 trapped bees begging for release. Clotilde could feel it in her ribs before she even saw the light. She was holding a candle beside Dorothea's bed, whispering a psalm over her when the candle flame stretched sideways toward the mirror. Then came the shimmer. Scott stumbled through, wings flapping, beak snapping, eyes like little red embers. "About time you all listened," he shouted, feathers scattering across the floor. "I told you my name's Ralph, and Gumbo don't belong in 2 wars at once." Dorothea gasped awake, choking on the air, her CPAP mask sliding off. Cora and Sean, still recovering from their own mess of miracles, ran into the room just in time to see the parrot hover over the bed like some furious prophet. "What the hell are you talking about?" Concepcion said, half drunk from grief and gin. Scott, or Ralph, pecked the air like punctuation. "Y'all keep mixing timelines. Gumbo ain't supposed to bleed through. He cracked a code in the veil. That fire in the jungle? That wasn't a vision. It was an echo from his purgatory loop. Y'all need to unloop him before it loops you." The air around the mirror went cold. Ralph's feathers began to glow faintly blue, casting light across the convent walls where faint shapes, faces, bones, maybe souls, seemed to press outward like damp hands against glass. And then, just like that, he softened. His voice broke. "Look, I didn't mean to bite the janitor, okay? He was whistling jingle bells and I thought it was a summoning chant." Cora stepped forward, holding a daffodil she'd picked from outside. "Scott, or Ralph, what are we supposed to do?" Find the writing beneath the writing, he croaked. You think those bones were decoration? That was a map. And if you don't act fast, Brigsby's going to feed them kids to his reflection. The mirror hissed. Ralph screeched once more, then imploded into feathers and smoke. Meanwhile, in the parallel reality, the museum felt wrong. The lights buzzed in strange rhythms. The air smelled like sweet butter mixed with something metallic. Loon and Merrick walked carefully between the exhibits, their footsteps sounding delayed, like they echoed a few seconds after they were made. Brigsby's silhouette moved through the dark, tall and thin as a scarecrow in a funeral suit. Now, he said softly. No need to be frightened. The popcorn's fresh. He handed them a striped paper bag. The kernels inside were pink like cotton candy. Merrick frowned. We're not hungry. Oh, but it's customary, Brigsby said. Popcorn is sacred here. Harriet Tubman loved popcorn, you know. And Joel Osteen, oh, he preached that salvation tastes like butter. The way he said it made both of them feel sick. Loon tried to hand it back, but when she looked down, the popcorn had turned into small, beating hearts. Professor, she whispered, what is this place? Brigsby smiled. His teeth looked borrowed. Parallel realities are like trauma bonds, my dear. Once you taste one, it clings. You'll understand once you've met the mirror saint. Behind him, the air began to shimmer. An altar appeared out of nowhere, covered in chicken fricassee, half-eaten green beans, and a Bible open to Proverbs 4:23. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. The words pulsed red. Back at the convent, Cora was trembling over Sean's body. She'd drawn a chalk circle around him, candles burning at every cardinal direction. She began to chant lyrics from one of her old Christian rap songs, Faith don't fold when the shadows fall, and mixed it with an ancient psalm. Something stirred. Sean's fingers twitched. Then his eyes flickered open like pilot lights reigniting. He gasped once and Cora screamed. He was back, but the mirror was glowing again. Dorothea stood near it, eyes wide and glassy. He's coming through again, she whispered. The one with no arms, no legs, the star. Ralph's voice echoed faintly from the other side, fading into a chaotic swirl of drums and laughter and sock-hop music. Doodah, wham bam, thank you ma'am, yo-ho Santa Claus, the sounds of every era folding together. And then silence. The scene split once more. Loon and Merrick saw Brigsby step closer, holding the keys to every locked door. He whispered, Let's see how deep the mirror really goes. He locked the museum door. The lights went out, and in the dark, the mirror began to hum again. Chapter 9. Ashes, Antelopes, and the Whisper of Falling Earth. The jungle smelled of iron and smoke. Flames licked the air like tongues trying to reach heaven, and beneath their wavering orange light, the sisters saw it all again. The field, the burning altar, and Gumbo lying on his stomach in the dirt of another world. It was a memory, yes, but also a doorway. Dorothea's mind drifted through the veil of time like a leaf caught in a slow whirlpool. She could hear the screams, the choppers, the sticky, wet sound of the rain that wasn't rain at all. And in that chaos, there was Gumbo, young, terrified, clutching his rifle, muttering a prayer that had no words. He looked up from the foxhole, his eyes glassy from sleeplessness, and for one brief instant he saw them, Dorothea and Clotilde, standing across the clearing as if reflected in a rippling mirror of heat. Dorothea in her old habit, the rosary swinging in the firelight, Clotilde holding the child that wasn't yet born, her face half shadow and half faith. They locked eyes, and then the air tore open with a crack that sounded like the sky snapping in two. Gumbo dropped his rifle and crawled toward them, bleeding and wild-eyed, whispering, I saw y'all before I met y'all. Dorothea reached out, her hand stretching across decades, and their fingertips touched. In that second, the fire changed colour, burning white as milk, the jungle melted away, and Gumbo was older again, standing in the convent garden with his bad leg and his tired grin, holding a basket of tomatoes like a peace offering to memory itself. Dorothea gasped, back in the present. Her heart fluttered. The fire that had haunted them all these years, the one in the field, the one that crossed time, had been their own, a loop of divine misunderstanding, a ghostly rerun, and somehow they knew that was how Gumbo had stumbled into their world the first time. He had crossed through fire, through the burning field of Vietnam, into theirs. The The veil shimmered shut. Weeks later, the world felt calm, but only on the surface. Loon and Merrick were working late again at the museum's library, an airy, high-ceilinged room that smelled like dust, leather, and quiet dread. Professor Brigsby sat at his desk beneath the portrait of St. Thaddeus, scribbling something in his notebook and pretending not to watch them. His shadow stretched long and narrow across the checkerboard floor. "Do you think he ever sleeps?" Merrick whispered, shelving a stack of anatomy texts. "Not since 1968, Loon muttered. "Look at him. He's like a raisin that took philosophy too seriously." Brigsby's voice floated across the room, dry as paper. "I can hear you." They froze. He didn't look up, just smiled, the kind of smile that could sharpen a pencil from across the room. By nightfall, when Brigsby finally left, the air shifted. The sound of his footsteps faded, replaced by the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the kind of hum that almost had a heartbeat. Merrick turned to Loon. "Do you hear that?" Before she could answer, a deep, smooth voice spoke from behind the glass exhibit of African fauna. "Children, you're working too hard again." They spun around. There, between two skeletons of extinct gazelles, stood an antelope, tall, elegant, eyes wise as the moon. Its mouth moved with human precision, the voice rich and warm like a late-night DJ who'd been reading the Psalms. "I told you I'd talk to you again once you were ready," the antelope said, bowing its head slightly. Loon's jaw dropped. You talk." "Only after hours," it said with a shrug. "Otherwise the tourists get nervous." Merrick blinked. "Okay, I've officially lost my mind." The antelope smiled. "No, Merrick, you found it. Just misplaced your bravery." They sat on the museum floor while the antelope, who called himself Elias, spoke to them about things they didn't quite understand but felt in their bones. How the world was thinning, how light had seams you could trip over, how forgiveness could fold time like paper. Loon leaned forward. "You mean what happened with Brigsby?" Elias's ears flicked. "The old man knows things about the painting he wishes he didn't. He's looking for something that isn't his to find." Merrick frowned. "So what do we do?" "Be still, observe, and remember," said Elias. "Wisdom doesn't chase answers, it listens for footsteps." He bent his head low, eyes glowing faintly gold. "But take care, little ones, the ground beneath you hums, change is coming. And when it comes, it won't knock first." At that exact moment, in the convent's courtyard, miles away, Dorothea felt the first tremor. It was soft at first, like a deep sigh underfoot, then stronger, rumbling through the bonsai garden. The prayer bells jingled madly, and the koi pond sloshed over its rim. "Earthquake?" Gumbo shouted, running out of the shed with a wrench still in his hand. "Not here," Clotilde said, steadying herself. "It's somewhere else. Something shifted." Back in the library, the lights flickered. Books began to slide from the shelves, one by one, and land open on the floor, all on the same passage from Proverbs 27:17. "Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend." Loon picked one up, her fingers trembling. The floor shook again, and through the glass, Elias the antelope looked suddenly frightened. "This isn't the storm," he said softly. "This is the warning before it." Then the skylight cracked. A cascade of glass rained down like frozen starlight, alarms blared, sprinklers hissed. The night turned silver with falling water and reflection. Brigsby appeared in the doorway, his silhouette haloed in flashing red light. "Step away from the painting," he shouted. But Loon and Merrick weren't near the painting. They were near the mirror Elias had been standing in front of, the one no one had ever noticed until now. And in that mirror, behind the dripping glass, they saw something move. Something enormous, something that almost looked like Gumbo's reflection. Alive, young, in uniform. He mouthed words they couldn't hear. Then the mirror slit down the middle like a wound opening. Loon screamed. Merrick reached for her. The ground roared, one last pulse, and then silence. The alarms went dead. The water stopped mid-air, hanging frozen like tiny diamonds. And somewhere in that stillness, Elias whispered, "The chain begins." Chapter 10. The Mauve Hour and the Missing Child. It was dusk, that peculiar shade between gold and bruised lavender, a colour the sisters would later call mauve, though it never quite looked the same again after this night. Dorothea stood at the window of her small office in the convent, holding the toddler on her hip. Outside, the bonsai garden trembled from the earlier quake. Pots tipped over like fallen chess pieces. roots spilling out like little veins. Gumbo was out there now, sweeping up soil and muttering to himself about fault lines and faith lines and why model cars always fell off the shelves during tremors. He had 34 of them, Chevys, Fords, one Lincoln Continental he called Obama, because as he liked to put it, it's the cleanest, classiest, and got the smoothest ride this side of the Potomac. Dorothea smiled faintly. Then her phone rang. It was Clotilde, breathless, voice shaky as candlelight. "Dottie? The kids, the museum. Something's happened." Within minutes, the convent was in chaos. Cora dropped her phone mid-text. Sean nearly tripped over a discarded diaper in the hallway, the toddler's handiwork clearly, and Concepcion came running out of the kitchen holding a frying pan like a weapon.
Not now!
Dorothea barked.
We have to go!
They piled into the old vehicles. The 82, the 89, and the half-restored 69 Chevy Gumbo had been nursing back to health. It roared and coughed like an arthritic lion. The toddler was buckled into his little car seat, clutching a rubber Mother Goose doll. Every time the car hit a bump, the doll quacked in that eerie old nursery rhyme cadence. "Honk, honk, here's a goose! Loose on the caboose!" At the museum, the air was still electric, the lights flickering like a slow strobe. The entire east wing smelled faintly of ozone, lavender floor cleaner, and melted wiring. Dorothea parked crooked, ran inside with the toddler clinging to her neck. Clotilde and Concepcion followed, their habits flapping like black wings. Gumbo hobbled behind, shouting, "Watch your step! Floors cracked like my toe!" When they entered the library, the scene froze them. The mirror Elias had spoken from was spiderwebbed with fractures, each one glowing faintly, and the floor was littered with waterlogged books and broken glass. "Where are they?" Dorothea gasped. "Gone," Clotilde said softly. The antelope said, "They're not gone. Gone, just somewhere else." Dorothea tightened her grip on the toddler, and in that instant the child's eyes rolled upward and he whispered something. Jiggling, juggling, trains and grain, blue eyes, pain. Then he pointed at the mirror. Everyone turned. In the reflection they could see a faint image, Brigsby's ghostly silhouette leading Loon and Merrick through a corridor of mauve light. Cora arrived moments later, hair perfect, start perfume heavy as prayer. Sean was with her, his arm still in a sling from the car accident, eyes bloodshot but handsome as ever. Dorothea felt a stab of envy at their youth, their swagger, their messy love. Cora was talking a mile a minute about signs and omens and how her latest Christian neo-soul track was trending on YouTube. A little mix of Lauryn Hill and Mother Superior, she said proudly. Sean just stared past her, clearly thinking about some exotic woman he'd met on one of his late-night car runs to Baton Rouge. "Sean, not now," Dorothea said, catching his distracted grin. "This isn't a sock hop. The kids are in trouble." Sean raised a brow. "You sure? Place feels like a malt shop run by ghosts." Gumbo snorted. "Least the ghosts tip better than tourists." They fanned out through the museum, the toddler toddling between displays. The building hummed. The sound of dripping water echoed down corridors, rhythmic as a slow heartbeat. Then Dorothea heard it, faint singing. From one of the older galleries, it was Loon's voice, or Merrick's, or both, layered like overlapping echoes. She followed the sound, the toddler bouncing in her arms, his little shoes tapping against her ribs. The singing grew louder. Not quite a song, more a chant, an offbeat gospel rhythm laced with a strange neo-soul undercurrent. Half prayer, half warning. When she reached the door marked Oriental Antiquities, painted mauve and peeling, she froze. The toddler squirmed. Little house on the prairie," he murmured. Dorothea looked inside. The gallery was empty except for one painting, the painting now alive with flickering light. The figures inside seemed to be moving, but not in a natural way. The colours breathed, shadows bent. And then she realised one figure was missing. The child in the painting was gone. Dorothea's stomach turned to ice. She looked down. The toddler was no longer in her arms. "Gumbo!" she screamed, running back through the halls. "Gumbo! He's gone!" Panic rippled through the group. Cora dropped her phone. Concepcion started mumbling in Spanish. Sean sprinted toward the basement. Gumbo, toe-throbbing, limped down the nearest stairwell, yelling, "My boy! He's got my genes! He can't have gone far!" But the museum was a maze. Corridors folding in on themselves, hallways that seemed longer or shorter depending on how fast you walked. Every doorway reflected the others like a hall of mirrors. At one turn, Dorothea caught sight of a smear on the wall, not blood, but a handprint made of mauve paint, the same colour as the fire from the field. Meanwhile, in a quiet storage room on the third floor, Professor Brigsby stood alone. His eyes were glassy, his breath fogging in the dim light. He wasn't quite himself anymore. He was half shadow, half memory, a man held together by obsession. He muttered something about the Barak pattern, a secret geometry of leadership and fate, something the mirror child had whispered to him. He drew it out on the wall with a black marker, looping between equations and verses of amazing grace. When he finished, he stepped back and looked almost proud, then suddenly confused, as though he couldn't remember where he was. A sound broke his trance, the faintest cry. He turned. The toddler stood there, barefoot, holding a tiny piece of paper. The professor crouched slowly. "What have you got there, little one?" The toddler handed him the paper. On it, scrawled in perfect handwriting, "We see you, Mr. Brigsby, L and M." Then the lights flickered. The floor shifted again, like the heartbeat of something enormous below. The toddler vanished. Brigsby screamed. Back at the convent that night, Gumbo found a model car resting on the doorstep, one he hadn't seen in years, a 1964 Impala, painted mauve. Inside it was a folded scrap of paper, the same handwriting, "Follow the tracks, the Orient waits." He dropped it, shaking. In the bonsai garden, the discarded diaper, the same one from earlier, rustled in the breeze and floated into the koi pond. The fish began to circle, frantic, then still. The water shimmered like a mirror. And from deep within it a whisper came, faint but clear. "Jiggling, juggling, the child is ours again." Chapter 11. The Carver of Parallel Things. The convent slept uneasily that night, if you could call it sleep at all. The aftershocks came in whispers, tremors that rippled through the pews, through the floorboards, through the restless dreams of everyone who had stood too close to the mirror. Gumbo was the first to wake. He'd been dozing in his chair by the bonsai garden, a half-eaten plate of chicken fricassee balanced on his lap when he heard it. The slap-slap of bare feet on wet grass. At first he thought it was a raccoon. Then he saw them. Footprints, small and perfect, running from the koi pond toward the convent steps, but they glowed faintly, like the residue of something not entirely from this side. He called out, "Dorothea, Clotilde! Somebody wake up before this gets biblical!" Within minutes, the whole crew was outside. Dorothea in her robe, Cora in her silk pajamas and leather flip-flops, Concepcion clutching a rosary like it might turn into a gun. The air smelled of rain and singed electricity. Sean was there too, his shirt half unbuttoned, looking like he'd just come from adultery or confession. No one could tell which. Cora shot him a glance sharp enough to draw blood, but said nothing. The footprints stretched in a zigzag pattern across the courtyard, glowing fainter with every step. The toddler was gone. Could he have teleported? Concepcion asked seriously. "You know, like Star Trek," Sean snorted. "Or maybe he's with the aliens. Again." Gumbo crouched down and touched the prints. "Nah, this ain't alien. This is museum business. Look here." He held up a little piece of what looked like thread. "Silk, not from here, imported. Museum inventory tag still on it, mauve silk." Dorothea's heart sank. "Brigsby." "Forget him," Sean said. "He got himself arrested last night. Got caught outside the public library wearing nothing but a velvet scarf and a Harvard lanyard talking about psychic bees and the geometry of temptation. He's out of the picture." "Arrested?" Dorothea blinked. Sean nodded. "Lewd behaviour, public indecency. They say he thought he was a walk-in for Sacagawea." Cora laughed too loud. "I knew he was weird, but that's a new one." By dawn, the police had cordoned off the museum grounds. The local paper ran the headline, "Professor of Antiquities found nude," quoting Lewis and Clark. But the relief didn't last. Someone new had arrived. Dr. Peregrine Voss. He was tall, pale, and looked like he'd been carved from marble that didn't want to cooperate. His suit was immaculate, black as a shadow in morning, and his eyes had the look of someone who'd seen too many centuries. When he shook Dorothea's hand, she swore his skin was colder than glass. "I'll be assuming curation of the institution," he said smoothly, voice dipped in sarcasm and faint disgust. "And cleaning up Mr. Brigsby's mess." He gestured toward the cracked mirror. "And retrieving your missing children, of course. They seem to be caught in what we call a dimensional fold, tricky but not irreversible. At first, none of them trusted him. He didn't smile, didn't blink much, and referred to the toddler as the specimen. But when he touched the mirror, it rippled like water, and through it they could see shapes moving, two teenagers and a tiny shadow between them, Loon and Merrick, and the toddler. "Hold tight," Dr. Voss said, "and whatever you do, don't speak to them until I say so, otherwise you'll attract the hive mind." "The what?" Cora asked, clutching her cross. "The residual consciousness of the alternate realm," Voss said flatly. "They communicate through shared guilt. Adultery, betrayal, grief. Any lingering emotional link can make you susceptible." Sean coughed. Cora shot him another look. Gumbo muttered, "Well, we're doomed then." Voss began chanting, not religiously, but like a mathematician talking to a god of equations. Symbols crawled across the glass like frost. The mirror pulsed once, twice, and then burst. A rush of air slammed through the room. Books toppled. Dorothea's veil blew back. And there they were, Loon, Merrick, and the toddler, crumpled on the floor, dazed but breathing. The toddler coughed once and said softly, "Mimor said the beans are ready." Then he fell asleep. They all rushed to him, crying, laughing, holding each other. For a moment, everything was right again. Until Merrick looked up and whispered, "Where's the antelope?" The tremor hit right then, harder than before. Glass shattered, lights flickered, statues fell. The bonsai trees outside tilted like drunks on a seesaw. Dorothea grabbed a pillar for balance, and Sean covered Cora with his arm. Gumbo, grinning like a madman, shouted, "This is it! The Earth's trying to sneeze!" Voss didn't move. He stood perfectly still, eyes glowing faintly silver, whispering to himself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the quake stopped. But when the dust settled, they realized something had changed. Dorothea was sitting on the ground, staring at her hands, her eyes unfocused. "Dottie," Concepcion knelt beside her. "You all right?" Dorothea looked up slowly. I think I'm George Washington Carver." The silence that followed was biblical. Cora blinked. "The peanut guy?" Dorothea nodded earnestly. "Yes, I can feel it. The soil's whispering. The plants are talking." She clutched her chest. "And they're angry." Voss tilted his head. "Walk-in phenomenon," he murmured. "Common side effect of crossing a folded dimension. Temporary, if we're lucky." "Temporary?" Gumbo repeated. "We already got toddlers vanishing, priests having visions. Now she's channeling a dead horticulturist. You call that temporary?" Voss only smiled thinly. "You're lucky it wasn't inbreeding. That's usually what happens this far south of the Appalachians." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The koi pond shimmered again, but this time, instead of a reflection, there was a faint image of Sacagawea holding a bundle wrapped in mauve silk. The toddler stirred in Cora's arms, eyes fluttering open. She said, "We didn't leave, we multiplied." Everyone froze. "Multiplied," Sean echoed. The child smiled sleepily. "The others are still there. They look just like us." The group stared at each other, shaken, trembling, uncertain whether to pray or scream, and Dr. Voss, the new curator, adjusted his cuffs and said quietly, "Well, that complicates things." Chapter 12. The Seeds of the Duplicates. The morning began with a smell, sweet, nutty, and faintly chemical, drifting through the convent halls. Dorothea had woken at 5:04 a.m. and decided, in her George Washington Carver incarnation, to conduct peanut-based miracles in the kitchen. By breakfast, she'd produced something resembling pistachio pudding, but the texture of wet spackle. She called it salvation paste. Concepcion had nearly called 911 after finding Dorothea whispering to the blender about nitrogen levels in soil. "It's the dirt," Dorothea explained earnestly. "The dirt remembers." Cora, bleary-eyed and nursing a headache that hummed like a fluorescent light, muttered to Sean, "This is how cults start." Sean, wearing sunglasses indoors, didn't answer, partly from guilt, partly from a hangover, partly because he still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. Meanwhile, Dr. Peregrine Voss had converted one of the museum's storage rooms into what he called a dimensional integrity lab. It looked more like a mad scientist's thrift store. Stacks of mirrors, half-melted wax figures, a glowing box fan, and 3 jars labelled Loon, Merrick, and Control. He was studying them. Not the kids themselves, but their resonances. because when the duplicates appeared, they didn't come through as full forms. They came as shimmer, as echo. And somewhere Voss had found them again. He turned on the recorder. Day 2. Duplicate signatures are stabilizing. Subject D, Dorothea, exhibiting walk-in phenomena consistent with historical agrarian empathy. I hypothesize the duplicates may represent quantum moral opposites, a kind of spiritual mirror seed. He sipped his cold coffee and looked up at the mirror in the corner. For just a second, Dorothea smiled back at him. But her reflection's mouth moved a few words out of sync. He blinked. She was gone. Across town, the Port Arthur Goodwill had just put up a help wanted sign. Gumbo, who had once been a street prophet, part-time wind chime salesman and full-time chaos ambassador, took the job mostly because they offered free donuts on Fridays. His first task was sorting donated boxes from the local library. They were unloading second-hand editions, dog-eared mysteries, outdated encyclopedias, and a whole crate labelled Scholastic Book Fair 1987. Inside were old copies of ghost stories of the Deep South and the human skeleton anew. When he flipped one open, a piece of paper fell out. It wasn't old, it was fresh. The ink still glistened. It said, "The bones aren't done speaking. Find the ones that hum." Gumbo looked around the dusty Goodwill warehouse. Somewhere near the back he swore he heard a faint humming.
At the same time,
Cora had taken up a side gig at the Cherry Top Malt Shop, a newly opened 1950s-style diner that no one had asked for. The whole place smelled like nostalgia and Lysol, vinyl booths, chrome stools, a jukebox that only played one song, Wham Bam Thank You Ma'am. She worked the afternoon shift, serving milkshakes to teenagers and conspiracy theorists. Sean came by once, pretending it was for moral support, but really to see if the waitress with the feather boa was working again. Cora smiled tight and said, "You'll be paying for your own fries today." That evening, back at the convent, Dorothea was still convinced she was Carver incarnate. She'd started labelling the plants outside with handwritten signs. Friendly clover, do not mock. Aspiring yam, needs encouragement. George Jr., be patient. When the others gathered for dinner, she presented a tray of pioneering desserts, oddly textured cream pies that nobody could identify. Gumbo took a bite, frowned, and said, "Tastes like enlightenment and drywall." Dorothea beamed. "That means it's working." The toddler laughed, and the sound echoed strangely, like two toddlers laughing from slightly different coordinates. Then came the flicker, the lights dimmed, and the mirror in the parlour began to glow again, faint, then strong, then pulsing in rhythm with the ticking of the old convent clock. Cora clutched her heart. Oh God, not again. A smell of perfume and ozone filled the air, a burst of glitter, a chime of unseen bells, and there she was, Sister Supreme. 7 feet tall in platform heels, wrapped in a flowing gown of tulle and moonlight, her wings half feather, half sequins, her voice equal parts sermon and sass. "Babies," she cried, fanning herself with a book of psalms. "What in the disco damnation have y'all done now?" The parrot, Ralph, formerly Scott, screeched. "It's her! It's the celestial drag act again!" Sister Supreme pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him. "Watch it, Polly, with the attitude. I'll exorcise that beak right off your smug little head." Then she turned to the group. "Listen close, my sanctified hot messes. Y'all stirred the veil too hard. The duplicates? They're not evil. They're replacements. Cosmic backups. Something big's coming, and this world's running low on originals." Everyone stared. She took a deep breath and sighed. "And before you ask, yes, it's supposed to make no sense. The universe runs on divine nonsense, baby." Then she clapped her hands, and the cracked mirror shimmered with light, showing flashes of what looked like a library. Shelves, dust, and in the centre 3 figures huddled over an open book. It was Loon, Merrick, and the toddler's duplicates. "See?" she said softly. "They're learning without you. That's what the mirror wanted all along. But don't worry, they'll come back when you've learned something real." Cora stepped forward. "Learned what?" Sister Supreme smiled, sad and dazzling. "How to love what you can't control." And with that, she winked, blew them all a kiss that smelled faintly of tangerine vodka, and vanished back into the mirror in a shimmer of glitter and gospel. The silence afterward was thick. Dorothea's pudding had hardened into a small green brick. Ralph muttered, "We're all doomed," and flew into the rafters. But Merrick said softly, "Wait, I can still hear her." He tilted his head. Somewhere, faint but clear, came the distant sound of a choir singing Amazing Grace. The others listened, and for the first time in a long while the fear quieted. Dorothea sat down slowly, rubbing her temples. "Maybe I'm not Carver after all." Sean smirked. "You think?" Dorothea shot him a look. "I'm someone else, someone who planted something, and it's about to grow." From outside came a noise, like the earth itself sighing. Concepcion ran to the window. We might want to come look at this." In the convent garden, beneath the sign marked George Jr., something was sprouting fast. Twisting, pulsing, glowing faintly mauve. And from deep in the soil came a voice, unmistakably Sister Supreme's, laughing softly. "Time to harvest, honeys!" End of Chapter 13. The Thing Beneath the Mauve. The sun rose pale and suspicious, like it already knew what kind of day this was going to be. A low fog hugged the convent garden, wrapping itself around the bonsai trees and the cracked Virgin Mary bird bath like silk on a bruise. Only 2 people were awake to see what had grown overnight, Dorothea and Gumbo. They stood there barefoot, coffee mugs in hand, staring at it. It was not a plant. At first it looked like coral, then flesh, then glass. Its colour kept shifting, 1 second lilac, the next something like the inside of a seashell. It pulsed faintly like it was breathing, and there were shapes moving beneath its surface. Shadowy, human maybe, or maybe memories. Gumbo rubbed his temple. "That thing's humming, Doro. I can feel it in my bad molar." Dorothea didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear, but recognition. "I've seen it before," she whispered. "By that fire in the jungle, the night you broke through." Gumbo's jaw tightened. "Don't say that. That was war. That was smoke and fever." She shook her head. "No, that was this." They stood silently as a faint melody seemed to drift from it, like wind chimes and lullabies mixed with static. Then suddenly, the ground gave a small shudder. The air grew colder. Dorothea took Gumbo's hand. "We can't tell the others yet." "Why not?" "Because I think it's listening." Miles away, in a creaky old house on the edge of town, Professor Brigsby, disgraced, arrested, supposedly dismissed, was not where the authorities thought he was. He'd slipped through the cracks of paperwork and shame, and somehow found his way back to his obsession, the painting. But this time, he wasn't alone. In a crawl space beneath an abandoned chimney, Merrick sat with his knees pulled to his chest, shivering. The makeshift room smelled like chalk dust and stale pipe tobacco. The only light came from a cracked laptop on a crate playing an old Martha Stewart episode on loop. Martha's calm voice filled the air. "When life gives you lemons, darling, make meringue, but always preheat." Merrick's throat was dry. "Martha," he whispered, "you got any advice for getting out of a psychopath's fireplace?" Outside, Brigsby hummed softly to himself, rearranging cans of cornflakes and toothpicks into some sort of ritual pattern on the table. His eyes were glassy. His hair was too neat for sanity, he murmured. "She said it would grow. She said it would open." And then, with a sudden grin, he turned toward the chimney. "Don't worry, Merrick. You'll see. You'll all see." Back at the convent, Concepcion was having what could only be described as an incident. It started innocently enough. She decided to make a fancy brunch after binge-watching Ina Garten reruns. But the barefoot Contessa didn't warn anyone about what happens when you try to flambe gin over an electric stove while wearing a feather boa and fuzzy slippers. By the time Sister Clotilde walked in, the kitchen was filled with smoke, and Concepcion was fanning the flames with a baking sheet, yelling, "It's all under control, honey!" Clotilde screamed, "You set the curtains on fire again! It's texture! Martha Stewart says ambience is everything!" Sparks flew up the wall. The toaster oven hissed. The gin bottle exploded like a cheap magic trick, and suddenly Concepcion was sprawled on the floor in a puddle of creme fraiche, half laughing, half crying. "I saw him," she said breathlessly. "Through the smoke! Brigsby! He's watching!" Clotilde froze. "That's impossible. He's in custody." Concepcion looked at her with wild, mascara-smudged eyes. "Baby, the impossible moved in with us 3 chapters ago.
Across town."
Loon sat alone in the museum's break room, nervously eating cornflakes straight from the box. She was jumpy, like her nerves had been wired with bad Christmas lights. Every creak of the old building made her flinch. On the wall, someone had taped up a framed photo of Barack Obama shaking hands with the original museum founder, A local politician named Earl Peanut Dupree. The photo was tilted slightly. For some reason, that bothered her more than anything else. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Nice hair today. You're glowing. Loon's heart stopped. She glanced around. The lights flickered. Then another message. Unknown. Do you know what's growing in your garden? She slammed the phone down and ran to the hallway, shouting, Merrick! Merrick! Her voice echoed through the empty museum, bouncing off glass cases and marble floors. No answer. But in one of the display rooms, a shadow moved. Tall, thin, deliberate. It stopped just at the edge of light. Loon whispered, Professor? The shadow smiled. Back at the convent, Dorothea and Gumbo were still watching the pulsing shape in the garden. It had grown. There were now veins of gold running through it, and faint whispering voices seemed to rise from inside. Gumbo frowned. You sure this ain't radiation? Dorothea knelt down. It's life. Not like ours, but life. He squinted. Well, it's ugly life. She gave him a side eye. So was the caterpillar. Just then, Ralph the parrot swooped down from the rafters, landed on Gumbo's shoulder and squawked. Lorna Luft says hi, bitches, before taking off again. Gumbo blinked. Who the hell is Lorna Luft? Dorothea whispered. She's Judy Garland's daughter. Why's your parrot name-dropping? Because he's possessed, Gumbo. They both turned back to the glowing mass. For just a moment, its surface rippled, and inside it, faint and blurry, they saw the reflection of the toddler reaching out toward them. Dorothea gasped. It's connected to him. Connected how? She didn't answer. Instead, she took Gumbo's hand. We have to keep it secret until we know what it wants. At the museum, Loon's breath came fast as she hid behind a display of fossilized shells. The shadow, Brigsby, moved closer, humming tunelessly, dragging something metallic. Suddenly, she tripped backward and hit a light switch, illuminating the entire hall. The figure froze. It wasn't Brigsby. It was the new curator, Dr. Voss, holding a strange metal rod and a bag of popcorn. He blinked. You shouldn't be here. She stood, trembling. I thought you were him. Voss's smile was thin. Oh, I am. Meanwhile, in the convent kitchen, Concepcion, still woozy from smoke inhalation and gin fumes, was lying on the floor whispering to the parrot. Ralph, what do you know? The parrot blinked. Everything, baby. About what? He cocked his head. About who's really under that garden. She froze. Under? Ralph fluffed his feathers. You think it's growing up? Honey, it's climbing out. That night, Dorothea sat on her bed, trembling. The toddler slept beside her, his small hand twitching in dreams. Outside, the fog rolled in thick, muffling every sound except the faint hum from the garden. Her phone buzzed. Unknown. You buried me, but I grew back. She dropped the phone, heart racing. Then, from outside, came a faint tapping on the window. Gumbo's voice called softly, Doro, come quick. It's moving again. She looked out, saw the earth cracking open around the garden. Light poured out, mauve and gold, spilling across the yard like liquid moonlight. And then something, tall, pale, and impossibly thin, began to rise from the soil. Dorothea whispered, Oh, dear God, it's him! But it wasn't Brigsby, not quite. It was something wearing him. And when it smiled, it had... Chapter 14. The Bones That Whispered Back. The creature rose like a forgotten thought, half light and half memory. Its surface shimmered, neither skin nor fabric, but a blend of something living and not, as though light itself had learned to bruise. It wore Brigsby's face, yes, or something that thought Brigsby's face was a good starting point, but beneath the illusion you could sense a deep distortion, like something stretching a mask too thin. Dorothea clutched Gumbo's arm as the thing opened its mouth. No sound came out. Only a hot wind that smelled faintly of creme brulee and ozone. Sugar burned to the edge of beauty. Gumbo whispered, That ain't no professor. That's something he dug up from the bad side of heaven. And as they watched, the creature slowly turned and walked toward the fog, disappearing into it like a ghost retreating into its own legend. Under the chimney, Merrick's world was dust and darkness. The air was heavy with soot. And his knees were cramping from days, or maybe hours. Time had gone rubbery, spent folded into that tiny crawl space. He'd stopped screaming 2 sunrises ago. Now he just listened. The house creaked and moaned like an old man telling secrets in his sleep. Somewhere above him, Brigsby hummed, pacing. Sometimes he'd talk to himself, muttering equations, biblical verses, fragments of old pop songs. Once Merrick swore he heard him quoting Blossom.
Whoa!
Brigsby had said, perfectly imitating Joey Lawrence's catchphrase, and then let out a low, horrible laugh. But now, something else was moving. A slow, wet sound, as though a hand made of silk was dragging across the floorboards. Merrick pressed his face to the crack in the brickwork and saw, through the dust and the flicker of candlelight, the shape. Tall. Translucent. Wrong. It bent toward Brigsby and whispered, though Merrick couldn't hear the words. Brigsby's back stiffened. His hands began to tremble, and then, as if in prayer, he whispered, "Show me where they sleep." Merrick's pulse thundered. He closed his eyes, but when he did, the light behind his eyelids formed faces, Sparky's face among them, his old dog, mouth open in a bark that looked like a grin. "I'm still with you," the voice seemed to say, "but not for long." Merrick sobbed silently, as dust fell like snow from the chimney stones above him.
Back at the convent, Gumbo, bless him!
Was coping in his own peculiar way. The discovery of more bones in the orchard behind the convent had initially sent everyone into panic, until he got the idea to repurpose them. He started crafting wind chimes, delicate things, femurs and wishbones lacquered and polished, strung together with fishing line and love. He named the shop Requiem Rattles and opened an Etsy page. Within a week, orders poured in from people with usernames like Moonmouth66 and Gothic Gardener. Then Channel 7 came calling. The reporter, a local blonde with anchor hair and that everything's fine gleam, stood by the convent's hedges and smiled into the camera. "Meet Gumbo Lockett," she chirped, "a Vietnam vet who turned the horrors of war and gardening into art." Gumbo grinned his gap-toothed grin. "I reckon bones deserve a second chance, just like folks do." The camera panned over the wind chimes, swaying in the breeze, clinking in a tune that sounded eerily like laughter. Behind them, the garden pulsed faintly in the mauve twilight. Meanwhile, Brigsby watched. From the edge of every shadow, from the reflection in the convent's chapel glass, from the flickering screen of Gumbo's TV during the interview replay, he was there. Not fully present, but there enough to make the hairs on the back of their necks rise. His obsession had become omnipresent, an infection in the narrative itself. Dorothea could feel it whenever she prayed. Gumbo could sense it in his teeth, and Concepcion swore she'd seen his silhouette standing behind her at the Goodwill just before she took the part-time job sorting old encyclopedias in the back. She told herself she was imagining things, until one of the encyclopedias opened on its own and whispered her name. Dr. Voss's flashback. Somewhere across town in the museum's dim archives, Dr. Voss sat under a single flickering bulb, reading through ancient field notes. His face was calm, almost tender, as though he were remembering something he both loved and regretted. He thought of the summer he was 11, of his father's library, the dust and sunlight caught in the curtains. His father's voice had been like gravel and honey as he said, "Never trust beauty that doesn't bleed." Voss had laughed back then. Now he just stared at the ink-stained notes in his hand. Realizing his father had never really been talking about art, a tear fell on the page. He wiped it quickly, annoyed by his own sentimentality. For a moment you might think him human, almost kind. Then his expression hardened. "Soon," he said softly, "they'll see why I stayed." Whether that made him saviour or villain, the universe wasn't ready to answer. Later that night, Dorothea couldn't sleep. The hum from the garden was growing louder. Her gums ached. A dull throb that reminded her of gingivitis from her childhood. She remembered her mother's voice. Pain in the mouth means secrets in the soul. She walked barefoot to the window and stared out. In the faint moonlight, the garden rippled. Something moved beneath the soil again, something trying to come up. And in the distance, just past the old fence, a figure stood. Brigsby, or the idea of him, staring back. He raised one hand, slowly, almost in greeting. Dorothea whispered, "Why won't you leave us alone?" The night didn't answer, but somewhere behind her, Ralph the parrot croaked, "He can't, baby. He's already in the house." The weight of feathers. The morning started soft, the kind of lazy Gulf sunlight that makes even the oldest paint on the convent walls look new again. Sister Dorothea sat near the bird bath out back. One sandal kicked off, her eyes following the way the toddler splashed at the edge, slapping the water like it was his personal ocean. Gumbo was nearby, tinkering with a rusted model car. It was his ritual, the gentle, creaky motion of sanding, painting, gluing, breathing. He always said working on models kept him from remembering things he didn't want to remember, though anyone who'd seen the faraway look in his eyes could tell he remembered them anyway. Dorothea's laugh came easily when she watched him, until she caught the faint scar tissue at the bend of his neck, the one that always made her think of jungle heat, of smoke and red dirt, of a war she'd never lived but had to live with. "You should rest that toe," she said, teasing. "You keep walking on that wart, and you'll end up limping at our own wedding anniversary." "Woman, I've been limping since '69, Gumbo said, grinning without looking up. The piece of it was perfect, too perfect, and maybe that's why the universe couldn't leave it alone. They'd gone into town later that afternoon, just to pick up some groceries and a bottle of something sweet. The toddler rode in the cart, making nonsense noises that Ralph the parrot, perched on Gumbo's shoulder under a ratty ball cap, occasionally tried to mimic. They were halfway across the parking lot of McAllister's Market when it happened. A woman, thin as a wire, wearing a cross the size of a belt buckle, stepped in front of them. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd spent too long sharpening it on gossip and scripture. "Shame," she hissed, loud enough for the crowd to hear. A nun and an old soldier, parading sin like it's Sunday best. Dorothea froze. The air turned glassy. Gumbo's hand found hers instantly. "I beg your pardon," she said, the words measured but trembling. The woman's husband, or shadow, stepped up beside her. "You got that poor child living in confusion. You ought to be ashamed. The Lord don't." Gumbo didn't let him finish. He leaned forward just enough that the man could see every year in his eyes, every ghost. "The Lord don't what?" he asked quietly. "'Cause the last time I checked, the Lord didn't have a colour chart." The parking lot went still. Even the wind stopped long enough to listen. Ralph fluffed his feathers, tilting his head toward the woman. "Judge not, lady! Squawk! Judge not!" Someone laughed. Then another. The couple's faces pinched up like overripe plums, and they turned, muttering. But the damage had already been done. Dorothea felt the sting long after they'd gone. Later, at the convent, she sat beside the bird bath again, letting the sun set on her hurt. Gumbo came up behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "People only hate what they can't understand," he said softly. "I don't want to understand them," she whispered back. "I just want to raise our son in peace." "Then that's what we'll do." But their peace was fragile, because as she turned her head, she realized the toddler wasn't at the bird bath anymore. "Gumbo," she called. He was halfway across the yard before she'd even finished saying it. The sound of sandals on gravel, her voice rising into a prayer, and that's when they heard Ralph screaming from the oak tree, "He's over the wall! Over! They ran. Behind the convent, the toddler had somehow squeezed through the garden gate and crawled halfway up the slope that led to the old well, the one they'd sealed years ago but always feared would give way again. Dorothea's heart slammed in her chest as she ran barefoot through thorns, shouting his name. Before she could reach him, a shadow swooped. Ralph, in a desperate flutter, knocking the boy backward just enough to stop him from falling. He landed in the grass with a giggle, clapping his tiny hands. Dorothea fell to her knees, gathering him up, shaking, laughing, sobbing all at once. Gumbo stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other wiping his eyes. "Never thought I'd see a bird baptize a baby," he said. Ralph preened. "Name's Ralph the Redeemer. Don't you forget it." That night, Dorothea dreamed again. She was back in the town square, surrounded by faceless people holding torches that looked like cat o' nine tails, each whip made of fire instead of leather. They shouted not words, but a rhythm, a beating sound that matched her own heart. In the centre of them all stood Gumbo, holding the toddler, his eyes reflecting the flame. "Let them burn themselves out," he said. "We just keep walking." When she woke, the window was open, and the wind was moving through the curtains like something alive, and outside the bird bath was filled not with water, but with feathers. Hundreds of them, all white, all perfectly still. the cakewalk of apparitions. The town fair had come rolling in like an unexpected resurrection, bright tents blooming in the twilight field behind the convent, the smell of funnel cakes and sawdust drifting over the cracked marble of the angel statue. Nobody remembered who exactly organised it. It just appeared one morning. Flyers stapled to every telephone pole from here to the hardware store. Square dance and cakewalk, free admission, live music by the Moth Tones. Sister Dorothea stood at the edge of the field, her hair a little too wild for polite company, her eyes hollowed out from nights that refused to end. Her hands shook as she adjusted the toddler's cap, the boy babbling to himself and clapping sticky hands. She'd checked herself into the mental health unit last week after the incident of the bird bath, as the town paper had christened it. They said she'd been found at midnight kneeling beside that cracked marble bowl behind the convent, whispering to the reflection of her own face, asking it questions only she could hear. They said she'd laughed when it answered. But tonight she was out. They said she was better, and she almost believed it. Almost. Across the field, Gumbo shuffled along with his cane, his knees popping like small fireworks. His new bone wine chimes had made the Port Arthur Evening News last week. Local veteran finds art in cemetery bones. He wasn't sure if they meant it as praise or a cry for help. But the Etsy orders were pouring in. He was wearing his old square dancing boots and a bolo tie that had once belonged to his cousin Reggie, who swore he'd played harmonica for Lynyrd Skynyrd before the crash. He winked at Dorothea and lifted the toddler high. The boy squealed, pointed toward the moon and said his very first sentence, "Bird fly home." Dorothea froze. Tears welled. She hadn't even been sure he could talk yet. But that was clear as a sermon bell. The music struck up. The caller was Sister Supreme, in her shimmering turquoise gown, hair piled high like an old Vegas showgirl, her voice a boom of both heaven and drag review. "Grab your partner, swing 'em round, don't let the devil knock you down," she called, rhinestones glittering like shattered stars. Concepcion manned the cake table, handing out lemon chiffon squares and judging everyone silently. Cora and Sean hovered nearby, their eyes sharp with unspoken fury. Something old and ugly simmered between them, a secret they'd been sitting on like snakes over eggs. The tension snapped when Sean said something about people who pretend to be saints but act like sinners behind lace curtains. Cora didn't hesitate. She slapped him with the butt of a pistol she kept in her tote bag for emergencies. Blood trickled down his temple, and then everything went to hell. The music faltered. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The toddler started to cry, but before anyone could reach him, Ralph the parrot swooped down from the top of the fair tent, screeching, "No, no, no," and grabbing the boy's shirt collar with his beak, pulling him back from the edge of the well where he'd crawled too close. The child toppled safely into Dorothea's arms, laughing like it was all a game. Then came the cold wind, a sudden, pulsing hush. The fair lights flickered. The air smelled like pennies and ozone. And in the middle of the dance floor, where the chalk line of the cakewalk looped around, a figure appeared. Faint at first, transparent, shimmering. A woman in white gloves holding a cat o' nine tails that dripped light instead of blood. She looked at Dorothea, then at Gumbo. Then at the child, and she whispered, "The garden is awake again." The apparition vanished. The music died completely. Everyone stood silent, as though the earth itself had stopped turning for a moment. Later, when the crowd had thinned and Cora was icing her bruised jaw behind the concession stand, Dorothea sat under the dim carnival lights, the toddler asleep on her lap. Gumbo sat beside her holding his cane, his bone chimes rattling in the wind. "Maybe it's time to leave this place," she said quietly. Gumbo nodded. "Maybe. But the question is..." He trailed off, staring toward the convent where a single candle flickered in the window, the same window where Brigsby used to keep watch before his arrest. "If we leave," he said finally, "who'll make sure it doesn't follow?" Dorothea didn't answer. Somewhere deep in the woods behind them, the sound of a baby crying echoed once, then stopped. And from beneath the cracked bird bath, something began to hum. The garden wakes. By the time the sun dragged itself over the moss-coloured bricks of the convent, the air already carried that murky perfume of soil, soap, and something faintly electric, as if the ground itself were remembering old dreams. The bonsai garden shimmered under dew, every miniature pine and maple perfectly manicured, yet quietly trembling. Sister Clotilde said it was because of the wind. Dorothea said it was because the garden was alive. And Gumbo, hunched over in his new gardening smock, cigarette tucked behind one ear, said it was because the bonsai didn't like being lied to. The jobs at the convent, everyone had fallen into their own orbit of purpose now. Dorothea, fresh from her stay in mental health services, managed the nursery and kept a watchful, soft-eyed love on the toddler, who now spoke in broken, adorable fragments. "No scarecrow eat me," he'd declared that morning, his first full sentence. It was such an odd thing to say that even Ralph the parrot stopped complaining for a moment. Sister Clotilde catalogued donations, mostly boxes of expired communion wafers and Goodwill rejects, and secretly kept a jar of pistachio pudding in the freezer marked Holy Anointing Cream. Cora handled the finances, though most of her spreadsheets were blank. Her mind still haunted by Sean, whose temper and charisma still crackled in the walls like static. Sean, meanwhile, was painting again in the basement. No one asked what he painted, but sometimes, faint through the floorboards, you could hear him singing Amazing Grace in a voice too sweet for the words it carried. Concepcion ran the kitchen with militant flair. Her chicken fricassee had become legend, and she'd even started experimenting with lactobacillus cultures for homemade yogurt. "It fights the thrush," she'd say, every time someone wrinkled their nose at the jars. Gumbo kept the grounds, the tools, the pipes, and the soul of the place in motion, between fixing leaks, pruning bonsai, and crafting wind chimes from his endless stash of bones, which were now a local sensation on Etsy. He found time to mutter prayers for fallen soldiers and ex-lovers. Ralph the parrot, still insisting he was named Ralph and not Scott, served as the convent's noisy moral compass. He'd recently started mimicking Sean's voice, saying, "I repent," which was both creepy and oddly comforting.
Enter Jermaine!
In came Jermaine. He arrived in the Thursday that smelled like Comet cleaner and creamed corn. A tall man in his 30s, dark skin, dreadlocks streaked with silver, and eyes that looked like he'd been places too strange to name. He carried a duffel bag full of comic books, incense, and a battered photograph of a man in uniform, Gumbo from 1968. "Name's Jermaine," he said, shaking Gumbo's trembling hand. "I think you're my great-granddaddy." There was a silence so deep it swallowed even Ralph's squawking. Then Gumbo grinned a slow, tooth-missing grin and said, "Well, hell, boy, if that's true, you inherited my bunions and my bad sense in women." They laughed like brothers, reunited after war. Jermaine moved into the old guest quarters and took a job restoring the chapel's stained-glass windows. He was an artist, a philosopher, and a part-time square dance instructor. Don't ask, he'd wink. His favourite Wizard of Oz character was the Scarecrow, because he knew he was dumb, and that's how you know he wasn't. The bonsai garden. The garden was something else entirely. It wasn't just a garden, it was a congregation of miniature universes. Tiny twisted pines stood in shallow bowls of black earth that shimmered when the moon hit it. Some said the soil came from Hiroshima, others whispered it was mixed with ashes from saints. Underneath one particularly gnarled bonsai, a Japanese maple shaped like an open hand, the earth had started to breathe. Not visibly, but if you stood close enough, you could hear the faint inhale-exhale rhythm, like the garden itself was alive and anxious. Jermaine was the first to notice. "Something's growing that shouldn't," he told Gumbo one dusk, the light lavender and gold, the colour of bruised fruit.
"Yeah,"
Gumbo replied, "Story of my life." But later that night he woke to the sound of chimes, his own wind chimes playing backward in the dark. The apparition and the scarecrows. That week, a square dance was held in the rec hall to lift spirits. Sister Clotilde wore a feather boa. Dorothea laughed for the first time in months. The toddler clapped from his high chair, shouting, "Cakewalk! Cakewalk!" as if announcing a prophecy. But when the lights flickered, just once, the mirrored windows of the rec hall reflected scarecrows where dancers should have been. For a heartbeat, everyone saw themselves as hollow-eyed straw figures swaying in time to a song they couldn't hear. Then the lights steadied and the laughter resumed, nervously. That night, Dorothea dreamed of crows nesting in her wrinkles, whispering secrets about the bonsai soil. A haunting quiet down under the chapel, in the little workroom where Germain kept his tools. A low hum began, not mechanical, not even musical, but ancient. Gumbo swore he saw the shadow of a man bending over the bonsai garden through the window at dawn, though no man was there when he went outside. Meanwhile, Ralph the parrot muttered in his sleep, "She's waking up! She's waking up!" By morning, the toddler had drawn something in crayon. A perfect bonsai tree, roots dripping red, and beneath it the word mother. No one taught him that word. When Dorothea asked who told him to write it, he pointed to the garden and said she did. And far away, deep under the soil of the bonsai bed, something turned in its sleep. Slow, hungry, and aware. Chapter 17. Runaway Grace. By the time the fog burned off the convent lawn, you could feel the air was loaded, static, secrets, and the faint lemony sting of toilet bowl cleaner from Concepcion's morning chores. She'd been itching again. What started as a rash bloomed into a full-blown case of mange and scabies, courtesy of one of her late-night misadventures involving a borrowed coat, a feral cat, and too much boxed rosé. The infection was making her slip between genders like radio stations. 1 hour she was Butch Concepcion, all swagger and suspenders. The next, soft-voiced and mascara-smudged, humming Besame Mucho to the mop bucket. Alcohol fuzzed the edges of her mind until she was half angel, half crash site. Messages in the paint over at the museum, Luna and Merrick were the only ones on shift when the painting started sweating. Thick streaks of mauve bled down the canvas, spelling the words, "The child rides, the wheels will sing." A snare drum rolled somewhere in the rafters, though no one played it. Then came a second message, quick and slanted. "When love ends, something else begins." The letters faded like steam off glass. Luna clutched Merrick's arm. "It knows about us," she whispered. Dorothea's intervention. Back at the convent, Dorothea cornered Concepcion by the laundry lines, her voice calm but edged. "Mihija, you're burning down your own temple." Concepcion laughed, scratching at her arms. "Then light a candle for me, sister." But when she saw Dorothea's eyes, steady, unblinking, she cracked. They sat together by the garden while Ralph the parrot whistled Amazing Grace off-key, and Concepcion finally said, "Maybe I should check myself in, before the mirror starts talking to me too." 2 hours later, she packed a duffel. Dorothea hugged her hard. "Come back when the bottle's empty, but your heart's still full." Gumbo and the doctor. Meanwhile, Gumbo took his bus pass and headed to the clinic. "Routine, Doc," he said, slapping his thigh. The doctor shaved off his skin tags, 27 of them, and drew blood. "A1C? Perfect. Blood pressure? Better than most men half your age?" The doc said. Gumbo grinned. "Must be the wind chime business keeping me young." He left with a band-aid, a clean bill of health, and an idea for a new chime made of tweezers and brass bells. The runaway stagecoach. The toddler had been obsessed with the old horse and buggy on the convent property. Dorothea called it a stagecoach from Heaven's thrift store. One Sunday afternoon, while everyone argued about who they'd cast to play themselves in a movie, the toddler slipped outside. Dorothea picked Meryl Streep. Cora picked Dolly Parton. Sean smugly chose Al Pacino. Gumbo said Morgan Freeman. Concepcion, calling from rehab intake, claimed Jennifer Lopez. And Ralph squawked, "I play me!" A gust caught the buggy's tarp like a sail. The old mare spooked, bolting down the hill with the child still inside. The wheels screamed against gravel, the sound of metal and terror. Sean tore after it, boots flying, Ralph swooping overhead like a green comet. At the last curve, the mare stumbled, the buggy tipping. Ralph dive-bombed the horse's ear, screeching. Sean leapt, grabbed the reins, and yanked hard. The whole contraption spun, splintered, and stopped inches from the pond. Sean clutched the crying toddler to his chest. Ralph perched on his shoulder, panting, "Good boy, good boy!" From the porch, Cora ran down the path, tears cutting lines through the dust. She saw Sean cradling the child, the sunlight catching his face just right, and something old and stubborn in her heart gave way. Cora's reckoning. That night, while the others cleaned up, she brought him tea. "You saved our boy," she said softly. Sean shrugged. "Didn't even know I could still care like that." "Maybe love doesn't end," she said, echoing the painting's words. "It just changes its costume." He smiled, unsure. "You think it's time for a new act?" "Maybe," she said, "but only if you stop flirting with the rehab nurse." He laughed. Real laughter, not the practiced kind. Epilogue. Glimmer later, the toddler slept soundly, a faint smell of hay and forgiveness in his hair. Dorothea watched from the doorway, whispering to herself, "Blessed are the small ones who ride before the rest of us learn how." Out in the garden, a single bonsai leaf turned gold before its time. Somewhere far away, Luna and Merrick stared at the painting again, realizing the dripping words had changed. Now it read simply, "Ask her about the cruise." And as the moon rose, a faint sound drifted through the convent courtyard, a snare drum rhythm, slow and steady like the heartbeat of something divine and slightly deranged, keeping time for them all. Chapter: The Idol and the Sand. There was no warning, just the hum, low and deep, like 1,000 monks buried under a desert whispering in unison. Then a flash of gold and the world folded in on itself. Dorothea, Clotilde, Gumbo and the others found themselves zapped into the idol's eye. For a heartbeat there was no sound, no air, only an infinite pulse, and then sand, sun, the smell of myrrh and rot. They were standing in the open air of ancient Egypt, though it felt less like history and more like they'd been dropped inside a dream. The horizon quivered in heat waves. Pyramids leaned in the distance like sleeping giants. The idol, now the size of a temple, glowed faintly in the middle of a cracked courtyard. It was watching them. They knew it. The silence pressed down like a physical thing. Gumbo shielded his eyes. "Where in the name of crawfish étouffée?" "Quiet," Clotilde hissed. "They're coming." From behind a row of sphinxes emerged a figure, tall, thin and veiled. Their face was hidden, their robe stitched with constellations. They didn't walk so much as glide, leaving no prints in the sand. "Welcome, children of the orchard," the figure said. Their voice shimmered like bells in boiling water. "You've been expected." Dorothea's heart hammered. Expected by who? The figure pointed toward the sky. A comet streaked overhead, green fire in daylight. It split the sky open for a second, revealing something vast and breathing behind it. "By them," said the figure, "by the ones who tend the harvest of souls." The toddler whimpered in Dorothea's arms. The sand shifted beneath them, pulsing like it had a heartbeat. The air smelled of honey, blood and rain that would never fall. "Where are we really?" Concepcion whispered. "This can't be Egypt. Egypt doesn't feel alive." The figure smiled, teeth black with coal. "Oh, it's alive. You're in the second echo, the Egypt that never ended, the one that kept dreaming after history moved on." Then the figure knelt, looking straight at the child. "The one you carry has done this before." Dorothea stumbled back. "Done what?" "Split the timelines," the figure said, "and sung creation out of tune." That's when the ground cracked. A fissure ran straight between them. Out from it rose faces, carved in stone, screaming silently. The air howled like an organ pipe. The idol trembled. Clotilde grabbed Dorothea's hand. "We need to get back." "Back where?" Gumbo shouted over the roar. "Ain't no back left!" But before the sand could swallow them, the veiled figure leaned close and whispered a phrase none of them would ever forget. The name of something so old and unspeakable that even the sun dimmed when they heard it. And then the world folded again. When the light cleared, they were standing in a different place, the same idol before them, but now it was buried halfway in mud, surrounded by cattails and the distant croak of frogs. The moon hung low and pink. "Where are we?" Dorothea breathed. "Home?" said the toddler in a voice that didn't belong to him, and just like that, the idol went dark. The next moments would unravel everything, and from this point onward, the story would begin to braid timelines, destinies, and the sacred madness of the Golden Orchard. Now, before I continue the full The idol in the mud. The moon was swollen and strange. It hung low enough to feel like it was listening. The air smelled of cattails, sulphur, and something that had recently been dead. Dorothea stood frozen, holding the toddler. The mud clung to her ankles like it wanted to keep her there. Gumbo was muttering an old war prayer under his breath, the kind he swore he'd forgotten decades ago. Cora touched the idol's surface. It was cold as iron, but pulsing faintly underneath, like a heart buried alive. "Home," the toddler said again, louder this time, and that's when it began to rain sideways. The Golden Orchard Convent rose in the distance, lit up like a ghost ship on a swamp. Fireflies swirled around its stained glass windows, painting moving halos across the bell tower. The new bonsai garden stretched across the courtyard, a mosaic of tiny trees, each shaped like a frozen explosion, tended by Sister Clotilde and her small team of caretakers. The convent was a community now, half holy refuge, half oddity museum. Everyone had a job. Clotilde oversaw the bonsai garden and taught meditation through pruning. Dorothea, when she wasn't attending her therapy groups or seeing Dr. Salazar at the mental health clinic, painted icons in the chapel. Gumbo ran the workshop out back, fixing clocks, radios, the occasional heart. Cora ran the kitchen, always smelling like gumbo and hairspray. Sean did the deliveries, food, letters and supplies for the outreach. He liked to take the long way back, just to clear his head. Concepcion floated between everything, part volunteer, part patient, part cautionary tale. The convent ran on equal parts prayer and caffeine. There was always a coffee pot brewing somewhere, always someone confessing to someone else under a flickering bulb. But lately, things had begun to shift. The toddler was speaking more, full sentences, sometimes in English, sometimes in something nobody recognised. The museum, the old Orchard Historical House down the road, had reported 2 bizarre events in a single week. 1, a portrait of a nun blinked at a tourist. 2, a glass case containing relics from the original orchard exploded from the inside out. And as if that weren't enough, the idol had followed them. Or rather, a piece of it, a fragment about the size of a loaf of bread that kept appearing in different rooms of the convent. No matter where they put it, it found its way back to the chapel by morning. Concepcion's mind was starting to unravel at the edges. The stress, the alcohol, the guilt, it all mixed into something toxic. She'd spent a night with a man she shouldn't have trusted, and it left her with a double curse, mange and scabies. Her skin itched like her soul was trying to crawl out. She started wearing gloves, hats, scarves, dressing in layers like she was hiding from light itself. One day she showed up in full mechanics overalls and a tie, hair slicked back, voice gravelly. The next she was in a sundress, perfume thick as syrup, singing along with the snare drum from the choir pit. Gumbo pulled her aside one night. "You look like you've been wrestling a raccoon in a gas station bathroom." She laughed, but there was nothing funny about her eyes. "I'm fine," she said. Just trying out new selves." But she wasn't fine. The toilet bowl cleaner incident proved it. She'd mistaken a blue bottle for sports drink, taken a swig, and landed in the ER for 3 days. That's when Dorothea stepped in, arranging for her to go to inpatient rehab, the same facility where Dorothea had stayed months earlier. Before she left, she and Clotilde had one last sit-down in the bonsai garden. The moonlight turned the trees silver, crickets played back up. "You think God forgives everything?" Concepcion asked, scratching at her bandaged arm. "I think he forgives what he understands," Clotilde said, "and he understands more than we think." They hugged, awkward, desperate, and for a moment all the madness stilled. Meanwhile, Germain arrived, tall, caramel-skinned, dreadlocked, eyes like wet moss, Gumbo's great-grandson. Nobody even knew Gumbo had a son, much less a grandson. He showed up with a duffel bag and a notebook filled with sketches of scarecrows, said he'd been called here by a dream. Germain took to the convent fast, helped Gumbo with repairs, brought laughter back into the halls. The toddler loved him instantly. And weirdly, the idol fragment stopped moving once Germain placed one of his scarecrow sketches beside it. Everyone had their favourite Wizard of Oz character. Dorothea loved the scarecrow. He's not dumb, he's just lonely. Clotilde swore by the Tin Man. Ain't nothing holier than a man who can cry. Cora, the cowardly lion. Naturally, he's all bark till the danger comes. Gumbo loved Glinda, said she had hoodoo in her high heels. Germain picked Toto, said dogs always knew the truth before people did. Then came the square dance and cakewalk. It was supposed to be a light-hearted fundraiser, music, laughter, a pie contest. But halfway through the night, the lights flickered. The snare drum stuttered by itself. A wind blew through the hall, carrying the smell of ozone and honey. Someone whispered, "The idol's awake again," and then the apparition appeared, tall, veiled, luminous. The same figure from Egypt, now translucent and shimmering like smoke in reverse. "Your timelines are bleeding," it said. "Resolve one or they'll all collapse." The toddler pointed and said clearly, "Grandma?" The apparition smiled, nodded once, and vanished. The next day, a runaway stagecoach tore through the Orchard Road, an old festival attraction gone rogue. Somehow, the toddler was inside, clutching Ralph the parrot. The horses were wild, the reins dragging. Sean and Gumbo sprinted into the road, but it was Sean who dove, grabbed the reins, got dragged 20 feet, and stopped the carriage inches before it hit the gate. Cora ran out, screaming his name. When she saw him cradling the toddler, bleeding but smiling, she felt something ancient shift inside her chest. Later that night, as the rain returned and lightning flashed pink over the bonsai trees, she whispered to him, "Maybe it's time we stop pretending we're just friends." Sean hesitated. "You sure? Once you marry a fool like me, there ain't no undo button." "Who said anything about undoing?" she said, and kissed him. Inside the chapel, the idol fragment pulsed faintly again. Gumbo watched it from the doorway, absently rubbing his clean A1C results in his pocket, skin tag scars still healing. Something was being resolved, yes, but something else was just beginning to stir, because as the thunder rolled, a faint whisper echoed from the idol, a child's voice. "Home," it said again, only this time everyone heard it. "Would you like me to continue?" Chapter 17. The sky trembled like memory. The air was heavy like it remembered something. All day the clouds had been hovering low over Golden Orchard Convent, too quiet, too still. The bonsai trees stood frozen in their ceramic bowls, leaves trembling with a nervous whisper of wind that wasn't quite wind. It was evening when Dorothea came out to the courtyard. The toddler balanced on her hip. The child had learned to hum now, small, secret melodies that reminded her of lullabies no one had ever taught him. He kept pointing at the chapel windows where the faint light from candles flickered like souls behind bars. Gumbo was at his usual place in the workshop, surrounded by bones and brass. The Etsy wind chimes that had made him locally famous now hung from the rafters, clinking with ghostly rhythm. The local news had even come by earlier that week to film him. He'd smiled for the camera, but afterward muttered to himself, "You can't sell peace of mind by the ounce." Germaine was in the bonsai garden, painting scarecrow figures onto stones and setting them in a spiral pattern that no one quite understood. "It's a protective sigil," he explained, though he couldn't say what it was protecting them from. Cora and Sean were in the kitchen, fighting again, quietly this time, but sharp as glass. Every sentence was a dart. "You still talk to that woman from the cruise," Cora hissed. "It was an Alaskan cruise for work," Sean snapped, his voice breaking on the word work like a lie too thin to hold its shape. Ralph the parrot, ever the instigator, squawked, "Work, work, work! Exotic women! Work, work, work!" Cora threw a dish towel at the bird and it fluttered out the window, laughing. That's when the museum lights went out. The Orchard Museum had been having paranormal anomalies for weeks now, whispering hallways, relics rearranging themselves, lights flickering Morse code messages no one could decode. Tonight, the two night guards, the niece and nephew who'd been texting back and forth with the pain, that unseen intelligence that haunted their devices, were the only ones inside. They were young, tired, and pretending not to be scared. Then, all at once, every artifact in the Egyptian wing began to hum. The sound wasn't loud, it was low, bone deep, like the earth remembering a funeral. The idol fragment, the one Gumbo swore he'd locked in the chapel, was somehow there again, centered under the skylight, pulsing softly. The niece dropped her phone, the nephew took a step back, and then the walls began to breathe. "Run," she whispered. But it was too late. The idol exploded into light. Not destructive, not fire, just raw radiance. And standing within that light was Concepcion. Not alive, not dead, something in between. Her eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. Her voice carried the weight of 12 lives. She was dressed in the robe she'd been buried in, but it shimmered with impossible colours, mauve and gold, like bruised sunrise. She smiled faintly. "Tell them I didn't go far." Then, before the niece could even scream, she was gone again. All that remained was the faint smell of creme brulee and smoke. Back at the convent, the storm hit. Rain came sideways, wind like torn silk. The toddler started crying, not out of fear, but recognition. Dorothea clutched him tight, whispering prayers she didn't remember learning. Gumbo felt it too. Deep in his chest, that strange familiar pull as if time were coiling backward. He grabbed his cane and shouted for everyone to get inside. But the storm wasn't just weather. It was memory itself unspooling. Inside the chapel, every candle flared high, the stained glass trembled with light, images moving within them like trapped souls trying to communicate. One pane showed Sister Supreme, the drag angel herself, appearing in a halo of sequins and lightning. She grinned down at Dorothea, half saint, half showgirl. "Baby, closure's a myth. All you get are better questions." Dorothea laughed through her tears. "Then what now?" "Now," said Sister Supreme, flicking a rhinestone tear off her cheek. "Now you dance through the thunder till it tells you what you already knew." And with that she vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of pistachio pudding and ozone. The runaway stagecoach struck at the height of the storm. No one saw where it came from. Some said it materialized out of the orchard mist. The toddler was the only one inside, standing on the seat, laughing as lightning forked around him. Sean and Ralph, the parrot, were outside before anyone could stop them. Sean sprinted across the mud, rain slicing his vision. Ralph flew ahead, screeching orders like a sergeant. "Left! Left! Grab the reins, stupid!" Sean leapt, caught the edge, hauled himself up, wrestled the reins till his hands bled. The horses bucked, wild-eyed, foam spraying like holy water. Gumbo, Cora, Dorothea, everyone ran after, screaming. Then, with one last surge, Sean managed to turn the carriage. It crashed sideways, snapping a wheel, splintering into the mud. For a moment, everything went silent except the rain. Sean crawled out, clutching the toddler. Alive, breathing, laughing. Cora fell to her knees beside them. "You stupid, brave, wonderful man," she sobbed. Sean smiled faintly. "Guess I finally earned my cakewalk." Ralph squawked, "He's a hero! Give him Gumbo!" And then the parrot passed out in the mud. That night, the convent power flickered. Gumbo sat by candlelight, bandaged hands shaking, staring at the idol fragment. It had returned again, sitting calmly on his table as if nothing had happened. He whispered to it, voice trembling, "You done what you came to do?" The idol glowed once, then dimmed. And outside, lightning illuminated Concepcion's gravestone, the flowers trembling from the storm, but beneath them, a faint hum rising from the earth, like a buried chord waiting to be resolved. Dorothea stood at the window long after midnight. The storm had passed, the bonsai garden glistened in moonlight. The toddler slept soundly, one hand clutching a small scarecrow figurine Germaine had carved for him. She could almost believe it was over, almost. Then the lights flickered once more. The radio crackled to life, unprompted. A voice spoke through static, soft, familiar, unsettling. Open quote, "Mirabella has returned. The third song is almost ready." Close quote, Dorothea's breath caught. "Who's there?" Static. Then another voice, lower, whispering from the idol's direction. Open quote, "Home isn't a place, it's the one who remembers you." Close quote, the radio went dead. In the distance, thunder rolled one final time. Not as storm, but as a drumbeat, steady and slow. The sky above the convent split with light that wasn't lightning. A shape moved within it, a door, vast and pulsing, forming across the clouds. Germaine dropped his paintbrush. Cora gasped. The toddler sat up and pointed. "Mommy," he said softly. And for just an instant, framed by that impossible light, they all saw her, Concepcion, smiling from the threshold between worlds. Then the door closed and the night went still. Only the echo of Ralph's sleepy voice remained, muttering, "Book 3's going to be wild." End of Chapter 18. The Stillness of the Second Son. The morning Concepcion died, the light came from the wrong direction. It spilled across the convent courtyard like liquid brass, shining through cracks in the garden wall and lighting the moss in a way that made everything shimmer too bright, too still, as if the day were holding its breath. She'd been fine the night before, buzzed but laughing, teasing Dorothea about her CPAP, crooning along to old vinyl. Al Green, the Delphonics, a touch of Celia Cruz when the whiskey hit right. But by dawn, something inside her had quietly given out. Dorothea found her slumped near the koi pond, half submerged in reflection, the water rippling around her fingers like it was trying to keep her tethered. One shoe missing, a faint smile on her lips, no violence, no struggle, just the eerie grace of someone called home too early by something that refused to explain itself. When they pulled her out, the scent of mauve-coloured lilies filled the air, though none were in bloom. Ralph the parrot perched above them, repeating the same phrase again and again. Open quote. She's lighter now. She's lighter now. Close quote. The convent sank into a collective silence. Gumbo stopped building his wind chimes for a week, unheard of. Sean stayed drunk for 2 days straight, then went to confession for 3 hours. Sister Clotilde, who'd loved Concepcion in the quiet, unspeakable way that breaks a soul slow, retreated to her quarters and stopped eating. Her rosary beads began to smell faintly of whiskey. And Cora, who began asking everyone to call her Cato, stood on the chapel steps and whispered, "She was the only one who understood me when I didn't even want to be myself." No one questioned the name change. It fit her. The sharp edges, the half rebirth, the determination to carry the pain like a trophy instead of a wound. When she signed her name Cato for the first time in the convent's prayer ledger, it bled through the paper as if the ink itself approved. Meanwhile, in the museum's sub-basement, Professor Voss, Merrick and Loon unearthed something that should have stayed buried. It began with a collapsed section of wall behind the Egyptian exhibit, the same area where the idol had been acting strange. Voss had insisted on cataloguing the rubble himself. No interns, he'd said, no witnesses. But Merrick and Loon, sharp-eyed and loyal to a fault, stayed late anyway. They found him kneeling in dust, staring at a set of hieroglyphs that pulsed faintly when touched. The symbols weren't standard Egyptian. They spiraled, looped, resembled both letters and musical notes. "What do they mean?" Loon asked. Voss didn't answer. He was trembling, not with fear, but with recognition. "They're the same markings that were in the chapel foundation," Merrick whispered. "The ones behind the bones." Voss's eyes darted up. "You weren't supposed to?" He stopped. "Wait, what do you mean the same?" And then the air shifted. The carvings began to hum, a low, throaty vibration that made the floor shiver. Dust rose from the ground in strange patterns like static, and for one unholy moment, the three of them saw something moving beneath the carvings, a shape trying to push through the stone, a woman's silhouette, hair streaming backward as if underwater, a mouth that opened but no sound came out. Then the light snapped off. Everything went dead silent except for Merrick's ragged breathing. At the convent, Dorothea tried to make sense of her grief by making lists. She listed Concepcion's quirks, the way she tapped her glass twice before drinking, her love of cheap cologne and finer souls, her habit of misquoting scripture like it owed her money. She listed her regrets, never telling her "I forgive you," sprain, never asking about the burn scar on her shoulder, never admitting that Concepcion's laughter was the only thing that could drive the demons out of that old house for a night. She listed the signs she thought she saw. Lights flickering 3 times, Concepcion's lucky number, the faint smell of coconut oil in her room, Ralph muttering in his sleep, "Don't close the door yet." Sister Clotilde came in quietly one evening and found Dorothea staring at the wall.
"You know,"
Claude said softly, "sometimes love's the worst habit we ever try to break." Dorothea didn't look up. "You still think she can hear us?" Clotilde smiled, hollow but warm. "I don't think she ever left." Cato, restless, began spending nights in the malt shop that had opened near the museum. It was all neon and nostalgia, teenage ghosts and jukebox dreams. She liked it there because no one expected her to be holy. She sat in the corner booth, chewing on French fries and sketching Concepcion's face from memory. Sometimes she'd add wings, sometimes a halo made of beer caps. Once she drew her with a mirror where her heart should be, and that one she didn't tear up. One night, as the shop's lights flickered and Be My Baby played on repeat, a tall shadow passed the window, thin, slow, familiar. Cato froze. It was Professor Brigsby. But he was supposed to be in jail. He didn't look in, just kept walking. But it was enough to make her heart stumble. She watched his silhouette fade into the mist and whispered, "You're supposed to be gone." The jukebox crackled, skipped a beat, and then, somehow, played a faint echo of Concepcion's laugh. Back at the museum, Merrick couldn't sleep. He returned alone to the chamber beneath the Egyptian wing, flashlight trembling. The carvings glowed again, faintly green this time, and there, wedged between 2 slabs of limestone, was something small and impossible. A fragment of Concepcion's necklace, the same one she'd been buried with. He touched it, and a voice slid through his head, like silk through teeth. Open quote. "Don't let them bury me twice." Close quote. He dropped the pendant and ran, breath ragged, heart hammering like the drums of some ancient ritual calling everything lost back home. By the week's end, Clotilde began seeing Concepcion everywhere, in the chapel shadows, in the reflection of the washroom mirror, once even inside her teacup, smiling up at her through the surface of the Earl Grey. She confessed to Dorothea, "She won't leave me alone." Dorothea placed a hand over hers. "Maybe she's not trying to haunt you. Maybe she's trying to hand something back." Clotilde's eyes filled. Her heart, her peace. That night, the bells of the convent rang by themselves, slow, mournful, off-tempo. Ralph woke up screaming, "The second son is coming! The second son is coming!" Germaine ran out into the courtyard, barefoot, shouting for everyone to look. And they did, one by one, faces turned upward, as another light rose beside the real moon, glowing like a second, smaller sun. The idol, the museum cover walls, everything began to hum in harmony, like a celestial chord that had been waiting centuries to be struck again. Cato whispered, "She's not gone, is she?" Dorothea shook her head. "No, she's just changing shape." And in that trembling golden light, the toddler pointed toward the sky and said his second sentence ever. Open quote, "She's dancing." Close quote. By dawn, the light was gone, but the carvings had changed again. The idol's eyes were open, and beneath the chapel floor, the faint sound of breathing could be heard, not menacing, not divine, just there. Merrick stared at the sound recorder he'd left running overnight. On playback, amid the static, a voice whispered, open quote, "Tell Clotilde I forgive her," close quote. Then another voice, lower, broken, open quote, "But she shouldn't forgive me," close quote, and the tape ended. The convent was quiet that morning, but everyone felt it. Something had shifted. Grief had not lifted, but it had found its rhythm. Cato poured coffee for Gumbo, who looked healthier than he had in months. Dorothea trimmed the bonsai trees, humming something that sounded suspiciously like a Mirabella song. Clotilde sat in the chapel pew, rosary in hand, smiling through tears. In the museum, Merrick and Loon scrubbed at the walls, pretending not to notice that new glyphs had appeared overnight, glowing faintly, spelling out something they couldn't yet translate. And in the corner of the security footage, just for a frame, Concepcion could be seen, transparent, beautiful, laughing softly, as if to say, "Keep going." Chapter 16, The Bones Beneath. The morning smelled of sage, rain, and old secrets. Germaine was up before dawn, shirt half-buttoned, a wrench in one hand and a half-eaten cruller in the other. Sean trailed behind him, whistling "Stand By Me" into the fog curling off the convent garden. The bonsai trees glistened with dew, and somewhere out back, Ralph the parrot was shouting something obscene at a scarecrow shaped suspiciously like Al Pacino. Open quote, "Say hello to my little crow," Ralph yelled, proud of his timing. Close quote. The convent itself had become a strange hybrid of repair site, botanical wonderland, and nervous sanctuary. Since Concepcion's death, the one thing none of them could say aloud without the air turning to glass, everything felt slightly off-kilter. Even the sky seemed to flinch. The exact circumstances were murky. She'd gone out one night, her mind stormed with half-mad ideas about saving everyone from themselves, wandered toward the ravine behind the old malt shop that everyone agreed had been a bad idea from the start, and didn't come back. They found her rosary, her flask, and one of her high heels half sunk in mud. No body, no note, just the sound of distant thunder and Ralph muttering, "Oh, hell." Cora, now Cato, because, as she told Dorothea with defiance in her eyes, open quote, "I've changed too much to keep the same name," hadn't spoken much since. The toddler, who now could say full sentences like, "Ralph is bad and I want more pistachio pudding," followed her like a small haunting. Close quote. Dorothea kept busy tending to the bonsai garden, her mind half fractured, half mended. She'd returned from her stay at the mental health centre with a new mantra. The mind is a broom closet, baby. Don't live in it, sweep it. Clotilde tried to smile, but her grief for Concepcion gnawed at her like gingivitis at the soul. At night, she'd light candles and whisper at the ceiling, open quote, "You always said you'd leave a mark. So where is it?" Close quote. Sometimes a faint perfume, cheap, floral, and defiantly alive, would drift through her room, and the curtains would move though there was no wind. The day of the excavation started cheerful enough. Germain and Sean were assigned to dig out the collapsed storage cellar under the east wing, a task nobody really wanted. Gumbo joked that there were probably more bones down there than in his Etsy store, heavenly rattles and wind charms. He wasn't far off. By noon, they'd hit something that clinked. Pipe? Sean asked, wiping his brow. Germain knelt. No, bones. A hush fell. The shovel struck again, clink, clink, clatter, until the whole floor began to crumble beneath them. A low groan echoed through the walls, and suddenly the earth gave way like a hungry mouth. The collapse sounded like a thunderclap. Dorothea screamed. Cato dropped the toddler's toy xylophone. Ralph shrieked, "Mayday! Mayday!" and flew into a stained glass window. Gumbo's dentures nearly fell out as he sprinted toward the noise. They found only rubble, a choking cloud of dust and the awful muffled sound of someone crying below. It took the rest of the day to dig Germain out. His right leg was twisted, his arm shaking uncontrollably, but his eyes were alive, wide and wet with panic. Open quote, "Sean's still down there," he rasped. He said it smells like bones. By the time they reached Sean, the smell of earth and rot had thickened into something unbearable. He was lying half-buried beneath a mountain of skeletal remains, hundreds of them, men, women, children, some with rosaries still tangled in their ribs. The convent's past was bleeding out in plain sight. Cato sobbed until her voice cracked. Germain, shaking, tried to pull Sean free, but the bones seemed to clutch him as though unwilling to let go. By the time they lifted him out, Sean was gone. His face serene, his hand still holding a toothpick he'd been chewing. Dorothea crossed herself 3 times and whispered, "God forgive this ground." The county showed up, of course. Police, priests, a priestess or two, an archaeologist who looked like she hadn't slept since the Reagan era. But within hours, the convent higher-ups swept in. 2 of them, Father Lionel, a thin man with a voice like sandpaper, and Sister Ruth Ann, who smiled like a guillotine, made it clear the discovery would be contained. Open quote, "This is holy soil," Father Lionel said. "The church doesn't need another scandal." "The Etsy store's closed, Gumbo," Ruth Ann added dryly. Close quote. So they sealed the cellar, swore everyone to silence, and told the local press it had been a structural accident, but at night the bones whispered. Meanwhile, over at the museum, Voss, Merrick and Loon stood before the artefact, the one pulled from the rubble weeks ago. The idol, the one that had, once upon a chapter, zapped them through time. Its carved face was different now. Eyes that had once been shut were open, and the hieroglyphs beneath it, lines of looping serpentine script, glowed faintly when touched by candlelight. Loon traced a finger across the symbols. "This one repeats," she murmured. "Looks like a word or a warning." Voss adjusted his glasses. "It's the same pattern found near the chapel foundation, almost identical." "Then what does it say?" Merrick pressed. Voss hesitated. Roughly translated, "Do not remember the sleeping ones." They all looked at each other, suddenly aware of the hair rising on their arms. That night, Cato dreamed of Concepcion. She stood beside a bird bath, wearing a sequined gown and a halo of static light. Her skin shimmered, not from life, but from memory. Open quote. "You think death means I'm gone?" Concepcion said, her voice both echo and silk. "Baby, I am the static between your thoughts." Close quote. Cato woke with her heart pounding and the sound of a faint melody, a Cato Nine-Tails rhythm on a snare drum, coming from nowhere. And then came the fog. It seeped through the convent, through the museum, through the town like milk spilled across reality. Inside the museum, the idol began to hum. The glass around it fogged over until only the faintest silhouette could be seen within. Loon leaned close, wiping at the condensation, and gasped. Behind the glass, something moved. At first it looked like a reflection, but the figure, pale, desperate, glowing faintly blue, reached out, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass. Voss dropped his notebook. "Dear God." The mouth moved silently, forming words no sound could carry. Open quote, "Set me free." Close quote. The light flickered. The air sizzled. Merrick screamed, and just as suddenly, the room went still. The glass stayed fogged, but the handprint remained. Back at the convent, Ralph the parrot whispered into the silence. Open quote, "She's not done yet." Close quote. And outside in the bonsai garden, something beneath the soil stirred. Chapter 17. The Sand Remembers. The night began with static. the kind that hums between worlds, that sound of air thinking. Dorothea had been sitting by the cracked window of her cell, folding laundry and humming Moon River to herself, when the floor began to vibrate. Gumbo was in the courtyard, hammering together another of his ill-advised wind chime prototypes, now fashioned from seashells, bone shards and a discarded cat-o'-nine-tails handle. Cato had gone quiet hours ago, sitting vigil beside the fogged glass at the museum, still staring at that spectral handprint that wouldn't fade. And then the light. A pulse shot through both the convent and the museum simultaneously, like a heart skipping a beat between two realities. The idol's eyes flashed gold, and a low, almost animal hum rattled through everyone's bones. Dorothea barely had time to say, "Oh no, not again," before the floor vanished beneath her. The desert hit them like a furnace, sand in their mouths, in their eyes, under their nails. The air smelled of copper, incense and sweat baked into eternity. The sun was a white coin pressed too close. Dorothea, Gumbo and Sister Clotilde stood in the middle of an endless expanse of ochre dunes and broken ruins that shimmered like mirages. Open quote. "Oh hell," Gumbo muttered, spitting out grit. "Either we're in Egypt or Port Arthur just got a makeover." "It's Egypt," Dorothea said, shielding her eyes. "And it's ancient. I can feel it." "Well, I feel like my depends just filled with scorpions," he muttered. Close quote. Behind them, a sandstone temple rose from the dunes, tall and solemn, its pillars carved with falcons and hieroglyphs that seemed to move in the heat. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and death. And then a familiar laugh drifted on the air. Concepcion. There she was, alive, beautiful, wild-eyed and barefoot, her sequined robe replaced with linen wraps and gold bangles. Her hair glowed in the sunlight like it was spun from fire. Open quote, "Concepcion!" Clotilde screamed, running toward her. She turned, her expression both radiant and haunted. "Don't follow me, mi amor," she said softly. "You'll only drown in sand." Close quote. Then she vanished behind the shimmer of a dune. They chased her through markets that smelled of honey and roasted lamb, past scribes who dipped reeds into ink made of crushed lapis, past towering obelisks where children played in the shadows of gods. Everywhere the world felt alive, too alive. The sun hummed, the sand breathed, the Nile sparkled with an intelligence that felt ancient and aware. Dorothea's robes clung to her like parchment. Gumbo stumbled behind her, his old war injury aching, muttering, open quote, "Last time I time-travelled, I just ended up at a disco in 78. This right here's too much cardio." Close quote. They followed the trail of Concepcion's footprints, barefoot impressions that seemed to glow faintly before the wind erased them. Each time they thought they were close, she'd appear again, laughing on a ridge or weeping by a date palm or whispering something to someone unseen, until they saw it. The burial. She stood at the edge of a sandstorm, shouting at two priests whose faces were veiled. They pointed toward a pit, a deep, fresh wound in the earth. From the distance it looked like a grave. Open quote, "You don't understand," Concepcion cried, her voice carried by the wind. "The gods aren't what you think. They don't want sacrifice. They want to escape," close quote, but they grabbed her anyway, chanting words that cut the air like knives. Dorothea ran, screaming her name, but her feet sank in the sand like quicksilver. Clotilde fell to her knees, clawing the ground, her sobs ripped away by the wind. They watched, helpless. As Concepcion was lowered, still thrashing, still shouting prayers and curses alike, into the pit. The sand began to close over her, swallowing her screams, until only her hand, reaching skyward, was visible, a glimmer of gold on her wrist. Then even that disappeared. Dorothea dropped to her knees. Gumbo covered his hat with trembling hands. The storm roared, and suddenly all was silence. Back in the real world, the museum. Loon was the first to see the reflection shift inside the glass again. Not just a hand this time, 3 figures. Dorothea, Gumbo, Clotilde, flickering like candlelight underwater. Open quote, "They're in it," she whispered. The idol pulled them through. Close quote. Voss paled. "They're not just in a vision. They're there." The others could see the shimmering desert in miniature behind the glass, like looking through a window to another century. And in the reflection, the faint outline of Concepcion's hand pressed against the inside, her bangles shining faintly as if caught between 2 suns. Desperate, Loon and Merrick ran to the convent. They found Mother Superior Eugenia, a woman whose wrinkles looked carved by lightning and whose eyes glowed like she'd seen time bend before, along with Father Lionel, the gravel-voiced priest who'd helped hide the bones. Open quote. "You don't know what you're asking," Eugenia said. "Time is not a road, it's a snake. If we pull too hard, it'll bite." "Then bite us," Merrick said. "We can't leave them there." Close quote. Reluctantly, they gathered the relics, bones, candles, a basin of Nile water from the museum exhibit. The ritual began in the chapel, the smell of frankincense thick enough to choke on. The Latin chants cracked the air like thunder. The idol glowed brighter, the walls began to hum, and back in the desert the sky itself began to tear. A vertical wound of white light. Dorothea grabbed Gumbo's arm. Open quote, "It's them! They're pulling us back! Well, tell them to hurry! I'm roasting like a cornflake in a skillet!" Close quote. They reached for the light. Clotilde screamed as her hand began to vanish into it, the edges of her body pixelating like sunlight on water. For a moment, it looked like they'd make it. And then Concepcion's spirit appeared. She was half buried in sand, eyes glowing like twin torches. Open quote, "No!" she cried. "Don't pull me out! Not yet! You'll bring them too!" Close quote. Wind howled. The idol's eyes went white. For a fraction of a heartbeat, everyone, both worlds, saw it. A shadow moving beneath the dunes. Massive, shapeless, ancient. It opened its eyes. Then the light snapped shut. The museum glass cracked. Dorothea and Gumbo collapsed on the chapel floor, gasping for air. "Absolutely, Brian. You've got it. This will be a long, cinematic..." Chapter 17. The Sand Remembers. The night began with static, the kind that hums between worlds, that sound of air thinking. Dorothea had been sitting by the cracked window of her cell, folding laundry and humming Moon River to herself, when the floor began to vibrate. Gumbo was in the courtyard, hammering together another of his ill-advised wind chime prototypes, now fashioned from seashells, bone shards and a discarded cat-o'-nine-tails handle. Cato had gone quiet hours ago, sitting vigil beside the fogged glass at the museum, still staring at that spectral handprint that wouldn't fade. And then the light. A pulse shot through both the convent and the museum simultaneously, like a heart skipping a beat between two realities. The idol's eyes flashed gold, and a low, almost animal hum rattled through everyone's bones. Dorothea barely had time to say, "Oh no, not again," before the floor vanished beneath her. The desert hit them like a furnace, sand in their mouths, in their eyes, under their nails. The air smelled of copper, incense and sweat baked into eternity. The sun was a white coin pressed too close. Dorothea, Gumbo and Sister Clotilde stood in the middle of an endless expanse of ochre dunes and broken ruins that shimmered like mirages. Open quote. "Oh hell," Gumbo muttered, spitting out grit. "Either we're in Egypt or Port Arthur just got a makeover." "It's Egypt," Dorothea said, shielding her eyes. "And it's ancient. I can feel it." "Well, I feel like my depends just filled with scorpions," he muttered. Close quote. Behind them, a sandstone temple rose from the dunes, tall and solemn, its pillars carved with falcons and hieroglyphs that seemed to move in the heat. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and death. And then a familiar laugh drifted on the air. Concepcion. There she was, alive, beautiful, wild-eyed and barefoot, her sequined robe replaced with linen wraps and gold bangles. Her hair glowed in the sunlight like it was spun from fire. Open quote, "Concepcion!" Clotilde screamed, running toward her. She turned, her expression both radiant and haunted. "Don't follow me, mi amor," she said softly. "You'll only drown in sand." Close quote. Then she vanished behind the shimmer of a dune. They chased her through markets that smelled of honey and roasted lamb, past scribes who dipped reeds into ink made of crushed lapis, past towering obelisks where children played in the shadows of gods. Everywhere the world felt alive, too alive. The sun hummed, the sand breathed, the Nile sparkled with an intelligence that felt ancient and aware. Dorothea's robes clung to her like parchment. Gumbo stumbled behind her, his old war injury aching, muttering, open quote, "Last time I time-travelled, I just ended up at a disco in 78. This right here's too much cardio." Close quote. They followed the trail of Concepcion's footprints, barefoot impressions that seemed to glow faintly before the wind erased them. Each time they thought they were close, she'd appear again, laughing on a ridge or weeping by a date palm or whispering something to someone unseen, until they saw it. The burial. She stood at the edge of a sandstorm, shouting at two priests whose faces were veiled. They pointed toward a pit, a deep, fresh wound in the earth. From the distance it looked like a grave. Open quote, "You don't understand," Concepcion cried, her voice carried by the wind. "The gods aren't what you think. They don't want sacrifice. They want to escape," close quote, but they grabbed her anyway, chanting words that cut the air like knives. Dorothea ran, screaming her name, but her feet sank in the sand like quicksilver. Clotilde fell to her knees, clawing the ground, her sobs ripped away by the wind. They watched, helpless. As Concepcion was lowered, still thrashing, still shouting prayers and curses alike, into the pit. The sand began to close over her, swallowing her screams, until only her hand, reaching skyward, was visible, a glimmer of gold on her wrist. Then even that disappeared. Dorothea dropped to her knees. Gumbo covered his hat with trembling hands. The storm roared, and suddenly all was silence. Back in the real world, the museum. Loon was the first to see the reflection shift inside the glass again. Not just a hand this time, 3 figures. Dorothea, Gumbo, Clotilde, flickering like candlelight underwater. Open quote, "They're in it," she whispered. The idol pulled them through. Close quote, Voss paled. "They're not just in a vision. They're there." The others could see the shimmering desert in miniature behind the glass, like looking through a window to another century. And in the reflection, the faint outline of Concepcion's hand pressed against the inside, her bangles shining faintly as if caught between 2 suns. Desperate, Loon and Merrick ran to the convent. They found Mother Superior Eugenia, a woman whose wrinkles looked carved by lightning and whose eyes glowed like she'd seen time bend before, along with Father Lionel, the gravel-voiced priest who'd helped hide the bones. Open quote, "You don't know what you're asking," Eugenia said. "Time is not a road, it's a snake. If we pull too hard, it'll bite." "Then bite us," Merrick said. "We can't leave them there." Close quote. Reluctantly, they gathered the relics, bones, candles, a basin of Nile water from the museum exhibit. The ritual began in the chapel, the smell of frankincense thick enough to choke on. The Latin chants cracked the air like thunder. The idol glowed brighter, the walls began to hum, and back in the desert the sky itself began to tear. A vertical wound of white light. Dorothea grabbed Gumbo's arm. Open quote, "It's them! They're pulling us back! Well, tell them to hurry, I'm roasting like a cornflake in a skillet!" Close quote. They reached for the light. Clotilde screamed as her hand began to vanish into it, the edges of her body pixelating like sunlight on water. For a moment, it looked like they'd make it. And then Concepcion's spirit appeared. She was half buried in sand, eyes glowing like twin torches. Open quote, "No," she cried. "Don't pull me out! Not yet! You'll bring them too!" Close the wind howled. The idol's eyes went white. For a fraction of a heartbeat, everyone, both worlds, saw it. A shadow moving beneath the dunes. Massive, shapeless, ancient. It opened its eyes. Then the light snapped shut. The museum glass cracked. Dorothea and Gumbo collapsed on the chapel floor, gasping for air. "Absolutely, Brian. You've got it. This will be a long, cinematic..." Chapter 11. Holy Aftermath and Cucumber Melon. The convent had grown quieter since the night the air itself split open like a scab and swallowed half its congregation into some unfathomable dimension. Dust still clung to the rafters, and when the sun came through the cracked window panes, it revealed streaks of holy light thick enough to look touchable. Sister Eugenia, the Mother Superior in all but official paperwork, sat in the breakfast hall, stirring her instant coffee like she was conjuring ghosts. The spoon clinked and echoed through the wide, solemn chamber. Beside her, Father Lionel slouched. 1 part priest, 1 part exorcist, 1 part high-functioning burnout. His Roman collar was stained with what he called holy residue, but what everyone else knew was ranch dressing. "Strange how quiet it's been since the incident," Eugenia murmured, eyes fixed on the stained glass window depicting the Virgin Mary. "You mean the one where half our friends got trapped in an ancient Egyptian afterlife and came back smelling like myrrh and axle grease?" Lionel said, deadpan. "Yeah, strange indeed." They both chuckled softly, that tired kind of laughter people used to keep from unravelling. The convent's hallway hummed faintly with life again. Gumbo had returned to fixing the plumbing, though his Etsy shop had quietly disappeared. Dorothea and Cato, formerly Cora, she now refused to answer to her old name, had retreated into the bonsai garden, pruning silence into tiny green shapes. Cato's laughter came sometimes, brittle but brave. She'd tie her hair up with twine and talk to the trees. Every leaf is an old memory, she told Dorothea. If you cut the wrong one, something in you forgets what love feels like. Dorothea nodded, knowing she wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, Lionel and Eugenia were deep in recollection. That impossible week when reality folded itself like origami and spat Concepcion, Gumbo and Dorothea into the sands of time. The Vatican never believed the story, of course. The local bishop called it an incident of mass hysteria triggered by excessive incense. But Lionel had seen the shimmer. He had seen Concepcion's face half-formed in the museum stone, pleading, half beautiful, half decayed, like a sandstorm trapped in human shape. Outside, the heat pressed down. The convent's air conditioning wheezed like a dying confession. Germaine sat near the courtyard fountain, tossing breadcrumbs for the parrot who'd adopted them after the collapse. The bird was a chatty little witness, forever saying, "Pin the tail on the donkey," at random intervals. Nobody knew where it learned that. It was during one of those long melting afternoons that the television in the lounge flickered to life. Some documentary was replaying the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase, and for some reason everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. "I remember that day," Lionel said. "Whole world froze like Judgment Day. It's funny what sticks in the human brain." "It's trauma disguised as nostalgia," Eugenia replied. "Like when you smell cucumber melon and suddenly remember who broke your heart." That night, a thunderstorm rolled through like a sermon. Gumbo dreamt of bones shifting under his feet, whispering apologies. Dorothea dreamt of Concepcion's eyes behind glass, and Cato, well, she dreamt of Sean, always Sean, his voice muffled under the sand, his hand reaching. In the dream, she tried to pull him free, but every handful of dust turned to moths and laughter. When she woke, her room smelled faintly of lotion and ozone. The storm outside cracked the sky wide open. By morning, tragedy came again, smaller, stranger, yet somehow more haunting. A 10-car pile-up just outside town shut down the main road. The convent became a temporary refuge for stranded travellers. Among them were prank callers turned penitents, a man selling tantric healing crystals out of his trunk, and an exhausted paramedic who couldn't stop talking about botflies. Cato helped bandage scrapes. Lionel heard confession from a man who swore he'd seen a ghost hitchhiking near the wreck. Sister Eugenia made sandwiches, humming a hymn about mercy that sounded like an old country song. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, Father Lionel found something strange. The museum relic, the same black stone they'd been guarding since Concepcion's resurrection, was fogging up again. He wiped the surface with his sleeve and for a heartbeat saw movement. A flicker. A form. Concepcion's face, or maybe something wearing her face, appeared behind the glassy rock, lips moving silently. "Lionel!" she mouthed, voice lost in the shimmer. He stumbled backward, crossing himself out of old reflex, though it did nothing. The image grew brighter, colours bending wrong, like an oil slick on water. Her hands pressed against the other side of the surface, and behind her, faintly, he thought he saw Gumbo and Dorothea running toward her through a desert storm. The lights in the room buzzed, and somewhere in the convent, the parrot started screaming, "Pin the tail on the donkey! Pin the tail on the donkey!" Then the stone cracked, a hairline fracture glowing red, and through it, a voice not entirely human whispered, "Not done yet."